Okay, welcome everybody. My name is John Broussard, and I am going to be your guide over this 10-week online class for the 2017 May exam of the FRM, or the part one section of the FRM exam. I just wanted to tell you how much I appreciate you signing on, and looks like we've got about 35 or 50 people on, so that's good. I'm going to give you a little bit of basic intro of myself, and I'd like for you to give me an indication of where you're watching. Um, I'm a professor at Rutgers University and the School of Business in Camden, right next to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Currently on the institution because I was granted a Fulbright this past fall, and of all places in Finland, and I am casting from Helsinki at the moment. I am my Fulbright was for the fall, and the semester ended, and my host institution asked me to stay, or at least extend my stay, I guess is what you would call it. And I agreed, and so I am here broadcasting from Helsinki, the Hanken School of Economics, right in beautiful downtown Helsinki. Although it's a little chilly right. Well, today we had a pretty day, but you know, it's Nordic, so it is cold. Anyway, it's a great day, and let's see. So, professor, I've been doing this instruction, I guess, prep course instruction for almost 20 years now. And I have got my charter, my CFA charter, and was that 97? Yeah, 97. And I finished this FRM thing in 1999. And I've been doing a prep course for CFA since 1998, 99, in that vicinity. And I've been working on doing FRM since about 2000. Uh, 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 yes, okay, so Stevie makes a good question, makes a good point, that the video keeps breaking out. I'm actually watching it periodically on my machine, so whenever you see me turn to the left that way, I'm only doing that for the uh, just to check to make sure everything's working. I realize that many of you are going to have video problems. Some of you may experience audio problems. This is the interweb that we're using to do the broadcast, and sometimes traffic is out of our control. I would recommend, if you are having streaming problems, to turn the video piece off. I mean, you see my face. You can turn it on periodically, uh, but that piece is really, I mean, it's there so that you can see that I am live and this is synchronous discussion, but it's not something that you actually actually need. I will say that I'm on a big internet backbone here in Helsinki, so there could be I guess there could be a somewhat of an issue on my end. I will grant that, but I can promise you that it's probably not on my end, and it's probably not on your end. It's probably somewhere between the two. And there are some things that we can control and some things we can't. And I will indicate to you that the video or the streaming aspect of it is one of those that we can't. So since we're writing on the web, we'll just have to do our best. I will tell you that I have experienced complete shutdown periodically, and when I say periodically, very rarely, but it's happened before. And the IT people, the good people at Capital at in headquarters in La Crosse, Wisconsin, are work on it as soon as possible. I do not believe that I have ever experienced anything that we've missed more than 15 minutes of a delay, and we've either made it up the next week or we've made it up a few minutes at a time over the 10-week period. I do not believe I've ever had an entire week shut down, although maybe I have, but I think it was before the new system that we have. Point is that I recommend that you contact the technical people if you're having some technical difficulties. However, if you see me talking and you do not hear any audio, that's probably because I did not turn my mic on. So feel free to jump in and post a moderator or question to say, "Hey, John, turn your mic on." Um, and that's. I mean, I'm going to indicate to you that I try my best to do all the technical aspects, but sometimes sometimes I won't be able to. Uh, um, and So this is a synchronous online broadcast over the web. There will be some issues. Hopefully they'll be minimized. Periodically you'll see me turn to the left like there. I don't have the setup here in the same configuration that I have it in my other, I guess, webinar room. But it'll work and everything is going to be good and we're going to have a great 10 weeks together. So I just wanted to give you an indication about that background. I am broadcasting from Helsinki. What I'd like to see is where you are watching from. So if you would not mind, please post into the chat, the moderator box. I guess what is that? The moderated chat, the Q&A box. And just let me know from where you're watching. I'd love to kind of get an idea. I do this every time that I've done. I do this every time I do this 10-week thing, and it's really nice for me to see the broad spectrum from where people are watching. This particular broadcast is 12:30 Eastern Time, which is I think 5:30 London time. I guess we've scheduled it because there's a little bit of I guess there's more of a group on the London side of the pond, and so I think I'm closer to most of the people watching. I see. Thank you, everybody. Um, uh, um, right here from Amsterdam, the UK, Paris, Manhattan, of course. Let's see where else. Moscow, real close by. Dublin, London, Fort Collins, Colorado. That's pretty cool. Uh, Georgia, the country. Okay, thank you very much. Boston, wonderful. Connecticut, Thessaloniki. I've actually been to Thessaloniki. Let's see, Sturgis. Or I hope I pronounced that correctly. Zurich. Um, that's South Carolina, Bluffton, South Carolina. Wow, that's pretty cool. Dubai, Saudi Arabia, Barbados. Wow. So we've got this is a pretty representative class every time that I do this seminar. And so that's wonderful to see that one of us. And we even have someone from Helsinki watching us, so that's great. I can't remember who asked the question right up front. Let me see if I can get. I want to grab this question specifically because I think it was good. Alexander asked a question that says, "How soon after class is the recorded session available?" That's a great question, Alexander. I will let you know. This is a synchronous broadcast, and I think within 15 or 30 minutes after the broadcast, the machine in the background, um, machine in the background goes through there, and I guess post everything up within 15 to 30 minutes. However, I would not bet on that. I would indicate to you that you should be thinking probably a couple of hours, and it should be there. I have never heard of any problem of the archive being posted. More than 24 hours after the original broadcast. So, Alexander, good question. Let's see. Shinmei asked a question if you can see the comments from other students posting, so it becomes easier to follow questions posted to you. Shinmei, I'm going to give you an indication. I don't know how to turn that on. Sometimes I see the questions that come through. Sometimes the other students see the questions that come through. Other times not. I think that the default is that we're going to that's going to be kind of like I don't know, not necessarily a hidden question session, but the posting is in a box. The way that the box is more of a Q&A for the student and the instructor. I will say that I will do my best. I will do my best to answer the questions directly. answer the questions directly. Um, or excuse me, I will answer the questions, but I'll repeat the questions before I answer it. So hopefully I'll be able to do that. Let's see, if you want them to see it, you can just hit the mark on the question. Is that the check mark, Jeff? This is, by the way, just to let you know, I know it's going to sound like, wow, man, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. Well, it's a new software this season, so there's always a little, there's always a little trick and a little quirk there that you haven't thought about before, right? Let's see. So I am going to turn this, accept, maybe. Does that mean? Yeah, okay. So uh, I just clicked I just clicked a check mark on a thank you from Alexander, who asked about when the recordings would be available. So, Chimney, what I will attempt to do as best as possible, whenever there are questions that come through that I want everybody to see, I will click it so that you can see that, if that's okay. Hopefully that'll work. So with that in mind, so we have about 60 people on now, so that's good. And we're again from all over the planet. So let's just keep it rolling there. I'm going to go ahead and close the box right now and move to the next slide to kind of just keep on going. So you know what? I wanted to. Well, I'll tell you right now. Here's the deal. Here's how we're gonna work. 10 weeks alive, and then there'll be some on-demand meeting archive sessions available for you. There'll be some concepts and practice questions periodically. We're gonna cover most of the learning objectives in the Part 1 curriculum. And I want you to feel free to submit questions just like you're submitting now. I will let you know, though, that we have a lot to cover tonight. It's going to be a little bit, I say we have about 90-something slides tonight. Next week or week 3, I think we've got like 120. So some of the material is a little bit more, requires a little bit more explanation than other portions of the material. I will tell you, even though this is the financial risk management exam, a lot of this stuff is qualitative in nature, and there's a reason for that, and the reason for that is because of the standpoint, or at least that's my personal opinion, is that we're dealing with human beings whenever we're in the financial markets, and human beings do not always act like a financial model would predict that they act. And therefore, what we need to know is we need to know some of the qualitative factors. Now, yeah, we need to know the models too, and we'll go through that. We'll go through that. So we will, we'll let you know. I will let you know as best as possible whenever you need to be able to focus in on a particular equation, on a particular quantitative topic that I think is a high probability. And then the qualitative pieces, I think I'm going to focus you on there. Sometimes I'm just going to tell you, you know what, you can read this slide just as easy as I can read it to you. And I will try my best to hone in on what I consider to be the higher probability components. Okay. When when the archived version is available, like I said, within a couple of hours, no longer than a day. If that's a good portion about this particular product, is that I'm going through some stuff and I may speak faster than my brain is thinking, so I might not even realize that I've made a mistake, or I might not even realize that I've said something contradictory. Feel free to go through on the archived version and get your hands around something, or at least figure out what was he talking about there, and send an email through the instructor email box. Nikhil asked a question, and I wanted to bring this particular question up. So Nikhil, I apologize for pointing your particular question out, but you're asking a very relevant question. Well, you know what? I'll tell you what. We're going to go through it. You're asking a very relevant question about whether or not you should go through the slides before class or during class. Well, you definitely should go through them, or at least follow along during class. I recommend you have them downloaded before each class, and that you should go through them I mean, in an optimal world, you would have read everything before we go over it, and we are pretty much going through nothing other than review. But you and I both know life is full of catastrophe, and there seems to be a catastrophe every day. And if you live in a big city, you have a catastrophe at least twice a day. That's from home to work, and then from work back to home. So I realize that it's not always going to be possible, but I do recommend that you download the material and you glance over it before we go to class or before we do the broadcast, so that you can at least get a good handle about what we're going to be just talking about. Uh, I don't think it's always required. I mean, some of you are going to know the foundations, which is this is part one. This is the stuff that we're going to talk about tonight. Uh, uh, Better than the quantitative material. Others of you are going to know the quantitative material, which I think we start on week 3, more than the foundations material. So it's really your particular background and what you consider to be valuable as far as preparing and participating. The structure about the class, the structure about the class is we're going to go for about an hour. We're going to take about an 8 to 10 minute break, probably 8 minutes. And then we're going to go for another hour, and we're going to take another break, and then we're going to finish up the last hour. Every week, that's how we're going to do it. I have periodically run out of time because I'm talking too much about a particular topic, but that's rare. Okay, that's rare. Usually, what I will do is I will speed up and slow down just to make sure that we get everything in within our 3 hours together. So that's the idea. That's the structure. So if you have questions, feel free to submit them, but realize that we will be covering a lot of material, and some nights I'll be able to address your questions. Some nights there'll be a lot of questions coming, and I'm gonna miss a few. So use the instructor email box. I look at that at least twice a week. And others at headquarters are looking at it whenever I don't look at it. So somebody should be back to you within, I'd say, 2 or 3 days, 48 to 72 hours. I do know, I guess some of you have asked issues about the Q Bank already, that there were some questions missing. I'll tell you that, there's always going to be technical issues. There's always going to be little typos here and there. I just want to bring that to your attention up front to kind of set the expectation that, not everything is 100% of the time. So you should be should be able to. I would indicate to you. Should be able to address some of the issues, within a day or two. The email box, the instructor email box, is located whenever you log on to your, what do they call that? The learning management system. There's a student section on there. You should have gotten a login from headquarters, and whenever you log into your, I guess, account, there's actually an instructor box up there that you just click on. I don't actually know the email address, to be honest with you. I apologize. It comes into this box, and then I open the box, and then I look at the messages and I respond back to it. So I don't. I apologize for not knowing all those particular details, but that's why I'm an instructor. I'm not necessarily the technical person. I am a technical person. My research is on high frequency trading, extreme value statistical analysis, and lately sentiment analysis and textual analysis of analyzing words and connecting that to financial market activity and risk. But I don't know all of things. I've been doing synchronous and asynchronous online. I guess I'm an online early adopter. Early adopter or adapter. I'm not exactly sure which one it would be. I guess adopter. And the technology changes so quickly. I don't keep up with it, but I do know when it doesn't work, and when it doesn't work, I understand. I feel the pain. It bothers me too. So I want to work with you as much as possible. Feel free to recognize that some things I will not be able to answer, and I'll just tell you to reach out and talk to your customer service person or technical support or whatever your account is. All right. So let's see. Let's go move to the next question, or next slide here. Let me move next slide here, which is the exam format. Well, many of you have probably already taken a look at this. You know what's going on here. This is GARP, Global Association of Risk Professionals. Part one exam. I don't know why we list both one and two. You're going to take one, and next year or next, November or whenever it is next that you plan on taking it, you're going to take part two. Both exams are 4 hours in length. Whenever I took the exam in 1999, it was a full day, one exam. It was 6 or 7 hours. I can't remember what the deal was. And then I want to say back in 2011, it got broken. 2012, it got broken into two parts. So it's a multiple part exam. You have to take part one before you can take part two, and you have to take part two before you can get the designation. They're both 4 hours in length. It's paper based. It's not electronic based. You can sit on both. I mean, you can sit for both on the same day, but you can't get the designation until you pass one and then two. Somehow the results show up, I don't know, 1 to 2 months after the exam. I'm telling you that sometime in June or July you're gonna know whether you passed or not. So what does this mean as far as part one is concerned? It's 100 multiple choice questions, 4 hours. You're gonna take it. What that means is an average of about 2.4, 2.5 minutes per question. Well, I mean it's 2.4 something, but point is that if you spend 5 minutes on a question, all right, I know what I'm about to tell you is probably something you don't want to hear, but if you spend 5 minutes on a question, that's negative 2.5 points. Okay, you should think that some of these questions are unanswerable since the dawn of time, and sometimes you just got to punt and just select B. If you don't know anything, you got a letter of the day and you're moving on. You're not going to be sitting there working 10 minutes on a 2.5 minute question. I mean, just don't do that. All right. Time management is probably, besides not preparing enough, I think the majority of candidates do not pass because they don't understand time management. And I just want you to, recognize the standpoint that you're going to need to know how to do time management. So, part one, 20% of the exam is this foundations part, which we're going to cover this weekend. Next week, I'm pretty sure I told myself to print out the schedule, and I printed it out. I put it in a pile, and I can't find it. Sorry. But I know the exam is about 20 questions are going to be the foundations part, 20 questions are going to be quant, 30 questions are going to be the financial markets of products, the derivative stuff, and bonds and things. And then 30% is going to be 30 questions are going to be valuation risk model VAR. So what okay, about how much you need to prepare. Right? You need to prepare. About 20% of the time you spend is going to be on the foundation stuff, and the vast majority of this stuff is story, structure. I would indicate more of a strategic type of structure that you need to think about. And so that's the story. I don't know what else to. I don't know how else to explain it because that's the regular way to think about it. Okay. What do I want to say on this particular side? 20 to 30% are going to be numerical questions. So I think that's the biggest surprise for most FRM candidates. They're thinking it's some kind of quantitative, that you need continuous time stochastic calculus in order to be able to pass, and the answer is no, because only about a third of the exam, at the most, is going to be quantitative calculations. And what I mean by quantitative calculations, I'm going to be calculations that you're going to be able to do on your calculator, not your Excel spreadsheet, or that you're going to have to write some C++ code in order to be able to answer. You should recognize one thing when you're preparing for this material. There will be some hard questions. There will, no doubt. Okay, no doubt. But if you are not able to answer a question, all right, well, if you're not able to answer a question, especially the calculation part, in about 2 minutes, all right, then you're spending too much time. What that means is that you should probably need to know more. Okay, you need to know more about the background so that you can apply that background to any particular question. Again, I'm not saying that you're not going to see any picky questions, but you're not going to be doing questions that's going to have part one, part two, part three, part four, part five, part six, part seven. You're not going to be doing that type of question. It just takes too long. Okay. Now also too, there will be some questions that you're going to have to do a step A and then a step B, but realize that, step A is going to only take you about 20 seconds and step B is only going to take you 30. It's not going to take 2.5 and then 4 minutes, because if it does take 2.5 and 4 minutes, you're generating negative alpha points. Okay, so I just want to bring that to your attention. Okay, and I'm going to highlight this. I'm going to highlight this. Well, let me see. How did that turn out? Okay, that's good. I don't necessarily like that. I like this. I like red. Okay. What I want you to realize is that if you spend too much time, then recognize the standpoint that that's not a good thing. I just want you to recognize that. The calculator. Some of you will not need to use a calculator for the vast majority of calculations because they're relatively straightforward. I can do multidimensional matrix algebra. I can do continuous time stochastic calculus. I don't think in those terms. I can do the work, and I've forgotten how to add. Not really, but the point is that make it simple on yourself on the calculations. Use a calculator that's easy to use. Now, what you're not going to be doing, is learning how to use your calculator on the exam. So you need to learn how to use your calculator before, and that means you need to be practicing on your calculator. Which reminds me, I wanted to make a mention about a previous point that was made up here on the exam. Okay, on the exam, no formula sheet. You're not going to be able to bring in a formula sheet. That doesn't mean that you can't use a formula sheet that you make up and that you prepare for. Now, Persuasion has a really nice set, quick sheet that they've got, a bunch of stuff, and it's got a bunch of formulas on there and all that. And for you, this may be extremely beneficial. Let me tell you, I think it is pretty beneficial, but you may wish to generate your own spreadsheet, a formula sheet, right? And I think that's just really valuable if you generate your own formula sheet. Recognize you're not going to be bringing that thing in on the exam, but it's going to be your formula sheet that you're going to be using for when you're taking it, when you're practicing and studying. Okay. And I forgot that I wanted to bring that point up. So we're going to be going through all that. You're going to be using the calculator. If you're not comfortable with the calculator, use another one. I don't know what to tell you. You're gonna have to feel comfortable with your calculator. By now, you should be feeling comfortable with your calculator. Keep it simple, right? Pass rates. All right, now this is a situation that candidates ask me, well, how much do I need to pass? I don't know. Right? I don't know. They don't tell us the cutoff. They don't tell us the cutoff. You should probably be thinking somewhere in the vicinity of 70% is a passing exam, but yeah, that's not a certainty, I guess, but it is a pretty good guide. What you should recognize is that any practice exam, any particular question example question that we do here is probably not going to be as difficult as the question that you're going to see on the exam. Why? Because you're taking the exam. Every exam is the hardest exam ever because it's the one you're taking. Right? Well, we know that. Okay, we know that. And what I want you to see here is look at the point one pass rate. All right. And especially what I'd like for you to see is I'd like for you to see the difference between the pass rates of May and November. Okay, the difference between the pass rates of May and November. And I'm not necessarily a trend follower. Okay, I'm not a trend follower. But I don't know about you, but what I see here is I see May. Okay, I see May being worse than November. I see May being worse than November. I don't know, but it just seems that way. Okay, it just seems that way. All right, and so I'm going to give you an indication that what that means. What that means is that it's not that May and June's exam come from the same material, and I don't think that they're making the exam easier in November. Right? I don't think that's what it is. I think that the standpoint is that many candidates don't put the requisite amount of time. And don't put the requisite amount of time, and then they take it and they realize what they needed to do, and then they study again, and then they do a better job. But still, look at these pass rates, ladies and gentlemen. This is below 50% here. Okay? This is below 50%. What does that mean? That means this is a tough exam. Right? It's a tough exam. And then on the flip side, okay, the flip side, what does that mean? That means this is worth your effort, right? Because if it were easy, okay, if it were easy and everybody would be doing it and the pass rates would be 75, 90%, I mean, then it wouldn't be worth your effort. Okay. Uh, this is survey data that we've got, and what I'm going to give you an indication here is that somewhere between, I mean, somewhere, what I'd indicate, that 80% of respondents say, greater than 80% of respondents, approximately 80% of respondents spend greater than 150 hours. Okay, that means you got to set aside time. Now, this is not 150 hours, including the prep course that I took. There's 150 hours that I did on my own. What I want to give you an indication is that you're just gonna have to put forth the time. Right? You're gonna have to put forth the time, and I know that's a lot. It is a lot, but uh, number one reason for not passing, not enough prep. Okay. Number two reason for not passing, after not enough prep, getting stuck in a time sink. You can fix both of those. Right? You can fix both of those. Still doesn't mean that's a guaranteed pass, but you need to put forth the records of time, and you need to watch the clock. Right? You need to watch the clock. Right? Let's see. What do we need to do right now? I think what you should be doing is that you should be, reading the book. Okay, reading the book, and at the end of every particular topic, there's concept checker questions and topic questions, and you should be feeling comfortable with those. Okay, and then there's the Q bank, and I know there's some issues with the Q bank. There's a couple of questions or a couple of sections that they haven't been filled in yet. That'll be handled shortly. There's also at the end, whenever I say at the end, somewhere what is it? Somewhere halfway through not part three. I mean book three. Okay, I would indicate to you that you should be thinking that maybe you need to start getting a little bit more practice on self-test questions. They're also included in this particular package. I know there's some additional things that you can get or whatever, but there's a practice exam booklet that comes with Schweizer, and then you can also get the exam from GARP. And I will tell you that no particular practice exam structure is foolproof. No particular source of practice exam is going to be the answer for you to pass the exam. Just recognize you're gonna have to read the material. You're gonna have to read material. You're gonna have to practice, and you're gonna have to be prepared. If you think that just reading old exam questions or practice exam questions is gonna help you, you're gonna be taking this again. I don't want to be negative, but uh, you know, you got to know the stuff. Right. Again, and I get this question every year. John, I worked the questions in the back of the book, and I took the practice exam questions, and I took the exam, and it just, was so much more difficult. It's always more difficult because you're taking it under, when you do these practice things at the back of the book or practice exam, you got the exam questions there. I mean, it's not exam day, right? And psychologically, it's different. And so just, the best thing that you can do is to be prepared, is to understand the underlying concepts of the particular type of question. Okay, particular type of question. Ram, I don't know. Ram asked a question about score, decile score. I haven't seen the new responses, the new exam performance questions or exam performance results letters from GARP, but you don't need to worry about that. You don't need to worry about it. The only thing you can worry about is preparing, putting forth the effort on what you can do. The only thing you can control is the amount of effort you put forward. You're not gonna be able to control the questions on the exam. You're not gonna be able to control the weather on the day of the exam. You're not gonna be able to control how somebody on the other end of the exam center is being loud. You're just not gonna be able to do that. The only thing you better do is what? Is understand the concept as best as possible. And that's what we hope to do over this 10-week time period, is to get you to understand the concept as best as possible. All right. So, any other particular types of questions before we get into the material? Let's see. No, okay, all right. So I think that's. I wish there was another place that I could put this moderator thing, because it comes up and I can't see the questions until it shows up on my screen in the middle of everything of what I'm trying to do. Technology is great and it works great. When it does work, it works really well. When it don't, it's not too good. You know what I'm talking about. All right. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started. All right, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to be talking about the foundations. This is what we're going to be covering this week and next week. Um, I think tonight we're going to cover up until about right here. Let me see. Maybe there's a question that just came up. Uh, let's see. Arun, please answer my question, please. Arun, I'm not sure what the question is because I did not see it. Maybe I missed it. But let's see. I'm gonna try to answer it. Help me. Ask it again. Oh, is there any negative marks for wrong answers? No. Sorry about that. Sorry. Sorry. And by the way, everybody, just another reminder. Sometimes I'm gonna miss your questions. I apologize for that, because sometimes there'll be a lot of questions that roll up, and I'll miss a few before I get to answer it. So, again, I apologize for missing that, but I should have answered that one when it first came up. My apologies. You don't get negative marks. So guessing is okay, and I recommend. Well, okay, you don't want to. You don't want to guess every question, right? But I've had this particular statement from candidates time and time again. John, whenever the proctor said that there was 5 minutes left or 10 minutes left, I still had 20 or 30 questions left. What did I do wrong? Well, spent too much time on probably one or two big, maybe more of a handful of questions, and didn't watch the clock. But if you leave 20 questions blank, okay, that's not a good thing. All right, that's not a good thing. So I would recommend to you, and I know a lot of people say, John, why do you tell people to do it the way you do it? Well, there's a reason behind my madness. There's a method. And that method is that this exam is a process. It's like anything else. There's so many things in life and the financial markets. It's a process. You can't circumvent the process. And the process is you've got about 2.5 minutes per question. And you're going to have that for the entire exam. If you do get stuck or you're not, on time, and you see that you've got about 20 questions left, and the proctor says that you only have 5 minutes, I mean, I don't know about you, but I'd be filling in the rest of the 20 and then go back and answer some of the questions, or at least look at them. But you don't want to leave them blank, okay? You don't want to leave them blank as best as possible. All right. I do not recommend, working a question and say, oh, that's hard, I'll come back to it later, and then skip it to the next one. There's two things that can come out of that. Number one, you're going to run out of time, you ain't going to come back. Number two, you could inadvertently, when you skip, answer the next question in the previous question slot on the sheet. And you definitely don't want to do that. Okay, definitely don't want to do that. Rab, yes, the sessions are being recorded and they'll be archived, and they should be available a couple hours after the broadcast. All right. Let's see. So where was I? Like I said, sometimes my mouth runs faster than my brain, and I lose sight of where I am. So anyway, so tonight we'll be talking, tonight and next week we'll be talking foundations, and I think we're going to be covering financial disasters and risk management failures. I don't think we get into the CAPAM tonight. Maybe. No, I don't think so. I think it's maybe there's some kind of other issues here, but it's mainly tonight is mainly I would say a qualitative discussion about risk management, basic structures, basic types. And the reason why I kind of hesitate to break it right here is because some of these concepts are going to be repeated maybe not necessarily in a particular topic that we cover, but they're going to be repeated and are discussed and are, I would say, connected throughout the discussion. All right. So please don't think that, oh, well, why is he talking about that? That's not a financial disaster. Well, yeah, but it could raise or it could increase the probability of a big loss, a big disaster. So we're going to try as best as possible to make the linkages that you should see in the material within the topic. Okay, within the topic. All right. So, foundations of risk management. What? How much is it worth on the exam? 20%. How many questions should you expect to see? 20. All right. So, and some of these are going to be qualitative. Well, not some. The vast majority of these are going to be qualitative in nature, and you should just be ready for not necessarily a storytelling session, but you should definitely be ready to see the big picture. Okay, you're going to need some specifics about some of the issues, but you're going to need to see. Right now, we're talking big picture. First topic: risk management helicopter view. I mean, this is a fantastic lead off reading. Is to get you to think about risk management from the what is that, the 36,000 or 38,000, or I don't know how high planes fly these days. Big jets. I mean, I think it's 36, 37,000 feet. Okay, to see of it up there, it says helicopter view. I guess. I guess after a while, if you get too high, you can't see anything. But what you should recognize here is that whenever we're talking about this helicopter view, we're really talking about big definition. What is risk? Now, I know you say, oh my God, I can't believe he's going down back so basic like that. Yeah, well, you know what? These basic questions show up a whole lot more than you think about on the exam. And people get like, oh, they get so stuck on things because they're just, too much is running in their brain. Okay. So when we think about risk, right? It's uncertainty, right? It's uncertainty. And what you should recognize here is that it's not necessarily related to the size of the loss. It's not necessarily related to the size of the loss because later we're going to be talking about frequency. When we talk about operational risk, we talk about this concept of frequency and severity of a loss or losses. Okay. So severity is a problem in itself. Okay. When you lose $7 billion, that's a lot of money. But if you only lose 7,000, but you lose it 1,000 times, I mean, so what you should recognize here is that risk is not necessarily directly connected to the size. Not directly connected to size, and I think that's a big distinction that you should recognize here. It's more of uncertainty, and really, from my perspective, it's getting hit with uncertainty at a higher frequency than you expected. So I know there's some convolutions that I'm going through there that we don't need to go through, but really you should just recognize, be focused, or at least not be focused, be thinking of it in the general terms here. When we talk about risk, it's really about uncertainty. Okay, it's really about uncertainty. Okay, room, yes. The size of the loss, yes. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not. I mean, it's not this. It's not the amount. Okay, I mean, okay, you say to yourself, well, John, if you lose $7 billion, that's a risk. Yeah, that is, right? The size is an issue, but it's not always connected to the size because, again, as I've indicated previously, if you lose 7,000 1,000 times, there's a frequency issue there too. So, and also too, if you earn, okay, if this variability issue, right? If first of all, if you are generating a Madoff type of where's it go? A Madoff type of result, right? That just goes up and up and up and up and up. That's a problem. All right, that's a problem. You don't have that. However, if you're generating this type of result, okay, you might have a problem there too, right? So variability, size, and it's all about uncertainty. Okay, it's all about uncertainty. So yes, size is an issue, right, of the loss, but the variability of the result is also an issue that you need to be thinking about, and the frequency of losses that come into play. All right. So when we think about the risk management, this whole concept of what we're doing is a process. Have I indicated to you that the exam is a process? Studying for the exam is a process. Taking the exam is a process. It's just a process. All right. There are two particular components of risk that we're going to be talking about: expected component of risk, or expected loss, and unexpected loss. Or I guess if you want to think about those, we'll distinguish the differences between those two later. And then what you should recognize here is that, yeah, let me ask you a question. 5 years ago, if anyone would said if anyone would say to you that interest rates are going to be negative, what would you have told them? Well, no, that can't happen because we know that that can't happen, and that is until it did happen, right? Well, okay, so that what does that mean? If you want a risk-free rate of return, you're probably going to do what? You're probably going to be not generating much return. That what not about the much return. Yeah, sir. Yeah, these known, unknowns, and known unknowns. Yeah, I mean we'll talk more about that later. But I guess what I'm talking about now, though, and what I'm talking about, sorry for that. And what I'm talking about now is that when risk, I mean, taking risk is something that you should recognize is a normal, I guess, a normal component of business, and so you should expect some degree of loss. Okay? But you should also recognize the standpoint is that there's opportunities for gains and there's opportunity for losses, right? That's what risk is, right? And if it were not risk, yeah, you say to yourself, well, John, if I go risk free, I'm just going to get gain. That is until what? Until a sovereign of which you invested all your money that is going to give you nothing but gains decides not to pay you anymore. I don't know about you, but that's a law. Right? So I guess the idea is that almost every activity we take has some kind of component or some aspect about risk. As a risk manager, right? As a chief risk officer, which we'll talk about a little bit later, our role is not to say stop, you cannot do that. Our role is to do what? Is to trade off the cost and benefit of any decision. Okay, it's the cost and benefit of any decision. Now, we do that analysis in an uncertain world. We never have 100% of all the data we need to make an analysis, but we have to do something. Yeah, we have to do something. And so that analysis, that process I call, that process, this risk management process here, you have to identify your exposure that you're willing to take, and we'll talk again more about that. All right. You need to quantify how much. First of all, what exposure do you want to take? Right. That's your risk. Right. And then how much of it do you want to take? And then you have to kind of balance that between the benefit of taking that risk. And then if that risk is somewhat large or you think it's more uncertain, you're not feeling as good about the component of risk as you are about the benefit, then there may be some kind of mitigation that you would like to take. And we always wish to do some mitigation about risk, right? We never, or I don't know about you, but I never, or I mean, at least I don't think I go into an investment decision or I go into a decision about life or anything that I'm going to lose when I do it. I just try not to do that. I mean, I just don't know. There may be decision A and decision B where decision A is going to pay less than decision B, but decision A is something that I want to do. So it's in the end, the benefit is better for me because there's a lot of non-monetary components associated with it. Right? So it's just a process. Right? It's just a process, and that we just need to be following the process as best as possible, or at least making sure that we get our idea about the process. And and so, what are the challenges that we have? We have to identify. Well, I just talked to you about the standpoint we got to identify what exposure we like, and saying to yourself, well, John, I can identify. I want to make clocks, and so therefore I'm going to take the clock risk, right? And then all of a sudden you get exposed to what? I don't know, currency or something. I don't know. You get exposed to. I don't know. Do they use copper anymore? Or do they use, I mean, some kind of raw material, right? And then you get exposed to raw material risk and commodity risk, and I mean. You get the point? I mean, yeah, even though you thought you identified the exposures, maybe you didn't identify them all. And then this mitigation or transfer, how do we do that in the most efficient way possible? Because we all know risk management is something that's not free. Okay, there's a cost benefit of the risk management process, and we need to be able to understand that. Right? Let's leave the F factor for after we finish here. Instruments may backfire. All right. So how many of you know of these inverse leveraged vehicles that are going to pay you 300% if some asset goes down, right? And so you say to yourself, well, yeah, I've heard about those particular instruments, and they're supposed to work. Yeah, and they are supposed to work, right? They are supposed to work. But the problem is that many instruments, exchange-traded instruments, tend to work a little bit better than off-exchange or non. Let me rephrase that. On exchange and off exchange instruments, and we're gonna be talking about this a lot. So I'm kind of laying a lot of groundwork here before we get into some of the details. But on exchange, off exchange instruments. On exchange instrument, what do we know? Default risk is extremely low. Liquidity is extremely high, right? But the instrument itself might not necessarily give you the risk mitigation or the transfer of risk that you're looking for. Off exchange, you can customize it, right? And it can actually be, you could create something to benefit exactly what you're looking for or take the opposite of what you're looking for. What's the problem with that, though? Counterparty credit risk and liquidity. So everything is a problem in some aspects, and that, some instruments that are too good to be true are probably too good to be true. All right, so you should just realize that that is the issue. In some of these instruments, and right now, some of the instruments that are being touted in the marketplace are these specialty ETFs that supposedly entities can use to reduce some kind of exposure. One of the problems is that that particular exposure that is being reduced is probably more idiosyncratic than it is systematic. And so from that aspect, that might be a problem. But I want to come back to this fraud or the F factor. Okay, we're going to be talking about operational risk a lot in the FRM program, both at part 1 and part 2. And fraud is a problem. Okay, fraud is a problem. I think you should just recognize if someone wants to steal from you, they probably are going to try to do it, and therefore that means it's difficult to fix. It's difficult to stop. It's difficult to stop, and I don't have the answer. Okay, I don't have the answer. And I know a lot of people say, "Oh, well, you have to have vetting and blah 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 blah." It just doesn't work. All right. If someone wants to steal it from you, just recognize the standpoint. You're probably going to get in a grocery store or a retail operation. I think that they think there's somewhere like 5% of inventory is going to be taken from them. You want to mitigate that, all right? You want to mitigate that as best as possible. You don't want to just open doors and not have anybody looking at the inventory. But just recognize the standpoint is that there's like a built-in loss factor. What you don't want, though, is that you don't want to overly expose yourself to fraudulent activity, and therefore having systems in place, therefore having checks in place. These are all things that you need to do, okay, and you need to have. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge, right? We're going to talk more about this a little bit later, but we talk about VAR. This is probably the most used and abused risk metric. It is a wonderful tool. It's easy to calculate. And it's easy to understand. We'll talk a whole lot more about it a little bit later. We'll talk a little bit more about it later. But some of the ideas about the qualitative and quantitative factors kind of come into play here. I've got about 3 or 4 questions here. Let me see if I can answer a couple before I get too far away. Everyone's asking a question about, after the loss comes up, was it expected or unexpected? Well, if you didn't expect it, then it's unexpected. So, but you're not going to be recording it as expected or unexpected. Don't worry about that. Instruments mean an instrument, a derivative instrument, some kind of structured product. I don't know. I'm not exactly sure what they have there. How much of a role do firms have in managing systemic risk, or is it primarily government intervention? So that's a good question, Alexander. I think generally speaking, firms do not have that much of a role about systemic issues, except for the standpoint that what? They can participate in certain types of activities that do what? Enhance systemic exposure. And the problem is that if everybody's doing the same thing, then probably nobody is protected. And systemic risk is different from systematic risk, and I think we all know that. But I think in the popular press we get too loosey-goosey with our words, and we think that we're just going to throw in just a bunch of mumbo jumbo and kind of clarify everything, and it just doesn't work that easily. It's more difficult than that. But I guess the point about that particular slide about the issue about systemic risk and idiosyncratic risk, I brought out that many times the instruments that are being used, right, are really more connected to idiosyncratic issues than they are to systematic or systemic issues. And I don't want to lead you astray with the terminology. I don't want to lead you astray in the terminology, but you should just recognize that. I should just recognize the standpoint that sometimes you can do what? You can protect yourself against what? You can protect yourself against beta risk. You can, or you can protect yourself against equity price risk. You can protect yourself against interest rate risk. But other times it's really difficult for you to protect yourself against equity risk, interest rate risk, commodity risk, government risk, regulatory risk, fraud risk. I mean, all of these dominoes coming into play. When the system breaks, it's kind of a problem, right? System breaks, kind of a problem. All right. Someone wants to ask about this graph. We're going to talk more about this whole concept of VAR a lot. Okay, so this is what VAR is, right? VAR is a stated number. It is a monetary unit, as opposed to standard deviation or beta or duration. When you think about standard deviation, it's like plus or minus 2 sigma. We're going to know 95%. Well, we can have confidence that 95% is going to be plus or minus 2 sigma. All right. Outside of that, outside of that 2 sigma is going to be 5%. All right. Well, whenever we think about VAR and we think about VAR, we're really doing that same kind of calculation, but in a one-tail issue. Okay, a one-tail issue. So when we look at this graph, we're okay with this particular aspect, and I didn't draw my arrow too well. 95% of the observations is essentially what we expect to see. 5% of the observations, 5% of the observations is also what we expect to see, but the loss, that amount that's associated with that 5% is the VAR. And you say to yourself, well, John, look at that number as a 15%. It's a percentage number. It's not a monetary unit. Well, then you need to apply that to the value of your portfolio to get your VAR. All right. 2 things I want you to remember about VAR. VAR requires 3 pieces of information before it's useful. Number 1, it has to have a monetary unit or a percentage or whatever you want to call it, but there has to be some kind of numeric combination, a numeric context in order for you to be able to understand what it means. As a matter of fact, that's one of its benefits because it's easy to use because you can compare a 5 million VAR of this particular activity with a 5 million VAR or 10 million VAR of another particular type of activity. So number 1, you need a monetary unit. Number 2, you need some kind of statistical probability component like 5% or 1% or 0.1%. Okay. And number 3, which is probably the piece that is least, I guess, highlighted because people just use the data kind of loosey-goosey, is the time dimension. Okay, is the time dimension. What I mean by the time dimension is that whenever we think about this probability of loss, we're talking about over some component of time, a 2-week time period, a 1 day, a 1 year time period, or a 1 month time period, or something like that. I mean, you need those 3 to be able to understand what VAR is telling you. So you see on this next slide, it says the 1 day, 1% VAR of a portfolio is $2.6 million. Okay? This means that there's a 1% chance that a portfolio is going to lose at least $2.6 million in 1 day. Or you're 99% confident that the portfolio will lose no more than $2.6 million in any day. And you say to yourself, well, John, what the heck does that mean? Also, too, I'm kind of confused as whether or not I use the minimum, I'm going to lose at least that, or a maximum, I'm going to lose no more than that. How many of you ever kind of thought about that? Well, this is the deal. When we think about the small number, this is the significance, this is the statistical component. And then when we think about the big number, this is the confidence piece. And I know both of them in percentage terms and both are in significance, both of them are statistical terms. Okay? But this is significance. Think about this as being significance, and think of this as being confidence. Right? So when we think about the small number, all right, think about the small number, think of that's the probability of losing at least, small least. When you think about the confidence, which is the big number, 95% confident or 99% confident, that's the bigger number, okay? Then that means you think you're going to lose no more than, no more. A big number, no more. Small number, at least, right? So a lot of times the candidates, I say, John, why are you hammering that out? Because on the exam, that's how it's going to be presented, okay? That's how it's going to be presented, right? And when you think about the structure, the way that it's going to be worded, ladies and gentlemen, it's going to freak you out. But if you always think, when Bruce told me small number, that means I lose at least that amount. Right? Large number, I expect to lose no more with that level of confidence. Right? Rami asked a question, is VAR negative or is it just the amount, value, at risk and can be addressed by a positive number? So that's a great question. And what I'm going to tell you, ladies and gentlemen, on the exam, when we think about VAR, it's risk. All right, so risk is loss, and therefore it's a negative number. But, even though it's on the graph, let's see what the graph is. Even though it's listed on the graph as being a negative number, sometimes it comes out to be 5 million. Okay, they state that the VAR is 5 million. But what that means is that's our expected loss. Okay, we expect to lose at least that number, or we expect to lose no more than that number. Right? I mean, that's the idea. Expect to lose at least that amount 1% of the time, or we expect to lose no more than that amount with 99% confidence. Right? So the 5, okay, even though it's stated in the positive term, really it's a lost number. Right? Except whenever we get to credit. Right? Except when we get to credit. Okay. Frequency. Arun, I'm sorry, I'm not sure what you're meaning there with frequency is, which frequency is. I've got a couple questions here. I'm trying to address one of them. VAR as volatility. Do we always have more information in the tail, or is it just ease of expression? Ram, I'm not exactly sure what you're asking there, but I'm going to give you an indication here. VAR is not just volatility. It's supposed to take into account what? It's supposed to take into account the variability of the distribution of outcomes. Right, the variability distribution outcome. So yes, we use variability, we use volatility to give us an indication about that variability of outcome to help us demarcate our loss number associated with the probability over that time horizon. Okay. Arun, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by frequency or which frequency, but the loss horizon, the time dimension, okay, whether it's a daily VAR, or whether it's a weekly VAR, or it's a monthly VAR, that's what I'm meaning. If I said frequency, I apologize for that. Okay. Arun asked a question. I'm sorry. Okay, this is frequency. This is just the proportion. This is just, think of this as being like a what? This is like a histogram, right? As a histogram. So we have these bars, and there's a frequency of outcomes, and the probability, the proportion, if you want to think of it, the outcomes on the y-axis. That's all that is. Okay. Let's see. Okay. All right. So now I'm getting a lot of technical questions. All right. Now, Ram asked a question, Shanae asked a question, Sfidi asked a question, and Ram asked again another particular question. And Aline asked a question, and I'm going to address Aline's first. I'm going to get to the issues about the volatility. How do we do that calculation? We're going to deal with all that later. All right. So, gentlemen, y'all just hold on to those questions for later. But Aline asks, is VAR always associated to the left tail, or is it also positive associated to the right tail as well? So, Aline, when you think about loss, right, that's usually on the left tail of an outcome, right? So if you think about expected return, it's positive and negative. I say, well, the expected return could be positive or negative, but you have an expectation and you have a distribution around it. Well, the VAR is on the left tail. except for when it's credit risk and credit VAR. We'll get to that later. But really, if you own a bond, okay, if you own a bond and your position is a loss, the credit VAR or the loss associated with the credit exposure, that's only whenever you're on the side of a gain is when the counterparty won't pay you. Okay, won't pay you. So, but you can think of it either way. Okay, you can think of it as either way because the way the traditional VAR is done, and now I'm gonna make a statement right now about VAR. Whenever I talk about it's the most used and abused metric out there in risk management, it is because VAR makes it look like we have such a nice, pretty distribution. This is not a nice, pretty distribution. It looks kind of symmetric, okay? It looks kind of symmetric, but it's not exactly. Also, too, many times we've got asymmetric, we've got left tail distributions, or we've got fat tail distributions, and we've got fat tail. And I apologize, my art's not that good. The technology of pen on the computer is not there yet. Point is that whenever we are assuming, okay, whenever we're assuming nice, well-behaved distributions, and we're using a particular measuring device to get an indication about risk, we might be missing some observations way out here, right? And we will talk a lot about that later, about some of the shortfalls about VAR, okay? Some of the shortfalls about VAR, but we'll. I just want to bring that to your attention right now. What's one of the reasons why it's overly abused metric, because the underlying data generation process is not as nice and pretty as the assumptions of the model assume, and we'll get to the model later. Katarina asks, why for credit risk VAR is positive? Well, when you think about you make, and this is going to be the last component I'm going to talk about VAR here. VAR is a big, very important piece because we use it so much in risk management, but it's 10 minutes overtime. Take a break. I'm about to anyway, when you think about if you own a bond, and that bond, you own a credit instrument, and that bond is positive, for you. And the credit risk, is that. The credit risk is that the counterparty is not going to pay you that gain. Okay, it's not going to pay you that gain. So from that aspect, that's the reason why we think about credit risk and the VAR of credit VAR kind of being on the positive. It's a right tail loss as opposed to a left tail loss, which is usually associated with some kind of market factor. Okay, again, we'll talk into more detail when we get into that, and we'll talk into more detail when we get into that component. But I was only bringing that point up because Aline asked the question: is VAR always associated with the left tail? Well, really, the particular model that we use kind of assumes a nice symmetric distribution. So whether it's left tail or right tail, it doesn't really matter. And it all kind of goes back to the question that was earlier. Is VAR a negative number? Because I see VAR represented as a positive number, and yes, it's technically a negative number, because it represents loss. But when it's stated, it's usually not stated with a negative component, right? It's usually not stated with a negative component. So, with that in mind, what I'd like to do is let's take about an 8-minute break. And let's take about an 8-minute break. And we're just going to pick up from where we are and just keep on going. All right? Okay? Let's take 8 minutes and be right back. Okay. Are we back on? Let's see. Are we back on? I think we are. So I guess some of you came in after the introduction that we were going to go for about an hour, take a break, and then go for an hour, take a break. Because I got about the questions that it's not logged in, etc. Marsha, I'm not sure about a dial-in number. I guess just contact tech support or some maybe customer service, or maybe you can send a message to the customer service desk through your account. I don't think that there is one. I'm not sure. Maybe they have something. Don't know about that. But Anyway, Garrett, you said 5 bullets is show different than in the book. I'm not sure which 5 bullets you're talking about, but if you want, shoot a message to the instructor box, and should be able to address that. Should be able to address that there. Again, yeah. So I uh, agreed. I agreed. I'm not sure which. I don't have the learning objective numbers memorized with the with the particular components, but if you want, I think I can get it. I think I can clarify it in an email or something like that. That'd be a little bit easier. All right, so we talked about some of the issues about the helicopter view. That's what we're talking about now. There's qualitative approaches. There's quantitative approaches that VAR is like one of them. All right, and again, uh, try not to get too hung up with the specifics on VAR just yet. Make sure that you get a good handle about what it's saying. When you think about significance, a small number, right? You expect to lose at least that amount. When you think about the confidence, that's the large number. You expect to lose no more than, right, that amount. And don't forget about the time dimension, right? Over a 2-day period, a 1-day period, 2-week period, an annual period, etc. Right? There's some other types of approaches that, even though this has qualitative scenario analysis and stress testing, there are some quantitative components associated with these. We'll get into the scenario analysis, a little bit about the stress testing, not as much about the specifics until we get to part two. But we still, even when we get to part two, we don't get into the massive amount of detail that banks have to go through whenever they do all their, I would say, various types of different stress tests that they have to do. But really, I think this is one of the components, and we will be talking a lot about the issue about ERM, enterprise risk management, a whole lot later. But it's a big deal, and I think one of the biggest problems and one of the biggest challenges we have as risk managers is to be able to aggregate all of our risk. How do I aggregate the risk of the commodity trading desk with the risk of the high grade corporate bond trading desk? I mean, you say so. Well, John, we can all do that, right? Well, you can do the VAR, and you can do the VAR of each and just kind of sum them up. But when you take the VAR in isolation of the commodity desk and the VAR in isolation of the bond trading desk, we're not taking into account what the correlation and how that might work. So just adding those two up is not necessarily the right answer either. Karen, every night we go 3 hours. Right, every night we go 3 hours. So what is that? 12:30 to 3:30 Eastern time. I am in. I am in Helsinki, so at 7:30 to 10:30 my time. But yeah, we go for the 3 weeks. We're going to go 3 hours. So approximately, you think about somewhere between 2 hours and 45 minutes or 3 hours is what we do. We may cut off early, but I have yet to do that. Just to give you a little break. But Arun asked the question: is that is ERM done independently? And the answer is, okay, again, we're trying to think up here, all right? We're trying to think up here. If you've got a trading desk that does their number, and you've got another trading over here that does their number, right? And you think all you're going to do is just take those two numbers together, that's probably not the correct approach because it isn't taking into account how they might interact. ERM is supposed to take into account how they interact, and therefore is an entity-wide. That's why it's called enterprise, is the enterprise level assessment. The whole point I'm just trying to make here is that integrating that stuff and putting together all the risk exposures of the various different business activities of the institution is a whole lot more difficult than just summing up their VAR. Right? And that's the problem, is that people think that we can just do this a whole lot easier, than, well, let me put it this way. It's not that easy, okay? It's not that easy. I mean, it's easy. You can just sum them up, right, and just add the number. 3 plus 5 is 8. And that might be okay, that might be okay. You say, oh, well, it's more conservative. But yeah, what that conservative means is that you are probably going to be setting aside too much in reserve or in capital, and you're not going to be earning enough. We'll get into all that detail later about the cost-benefit analysis. Expected versus unexpected losses. We kind of touched on this a little bit earlier. When we think about expected loss, this is like normal course of business. Okay, expecting is normal course of business, and I made an indication about if you're a retail operation, or if you were a grocery store, or if you are if you work at you just make regular loans. There's going to be bad debt expense, right? There's going to be what do they call that? Leakage, okay, in some parlance of retail operation term. And I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that in your normal course of business, you can generally say, okay, I'm going to lose 2% of that, or I'm going to lose 5% of that, whatever the number is. That's what you expect, and therefore you set aside on your financials some kind of reserve to cover that, right? Unexpected loss, however, okay, unexpected loss is that stuff that you did not set aside, okay, because of normal course of business. And some people say, well, you didn't set it aside because you didn't want to. Well, no, that's not what unexpected loss is. Okay? I mean, losing a portion of the inventory is expected, right? Is expected. You might pick a wrong number, okay? You might pick a wrong number, but that component is the expected piece. The tornado coming down Main Street and taking down your operation, I hope that's unexpected. Okay, I hope that's unexpected. So it's a whole lot more difficult to prepare for, and there's all kinds of big problems there, negative macroeconomic impacts. Okay, so who I know everybody's going to say, oh, well, I knew that, I knew that. Who in here forecast negative rates to start off in one country, and then just for a while, it looked like everybody was going to go negative. I guess things have turned around now, and they're not as much negative rates as we had even last year. Okay, But even last year, the number of sovereigns that were in negative yield territory, right? It's still mind-boggling that we could actually have, that particular realization out in our economic condition, the economic environment. All right. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that you do have unexpected and expected loss, so from losses from change of line of business is expected or unexpected. I'm not sure what you mean. Change of line of business. Are you talking about having a new business or doing something new? Well, each particular line of business has its own level of expected, a day-to-day type of activity. So, if you move from one line of business, you've had expected loss. You move to another line of business, that's an expected loss in that other line of business. Lee asks a good question. Is enterprise risk management supposed to be separate and independent from other risk units, for example, credit risk, market risk, etc.? So technically, you ask a fantastic question. Okay, you ask a fantastic question. All right, that's the problem, right? So the example that I just said is the enterprise level. How do I just take the market risk of the commodity trading desk or the market risk of the high grade corporate desk, right? That has nothing to do, okay, and well, not nothing. I say nothing, meaning I'm assuming that they're not connected. Okay, I'm assuming that they're not connected, but they do have some kind of connection, and we do have to take into account the market risk. How am I going to have an expected risk number for that market risk? And then I've got the credit risk over on the commodity desk. You say, so what credit risk on a commodity desk? Well, a lot of times there's a lot of forward contracts on commodity desk that are off exchange. Right, so you can do that. Okay, you can do that, and on the commodity desk, but that's credit exposure. And then you've got over here on the high grade corporate desk that you also have credit exposure. So how do I? This was the problem I was talking about. The standpoint is that everybody says, well, just sum them up all together. Yeah, you can do that. You're assuming the correlation is 1. So Ron just raised a good question. It's not fair to keep VAR closer to 1 to be fully additive. Well, that means that you might be taking more. Okay, you might be trying to protect yourself. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that your risk number is probably going to be too large, and you're going to be setting aside too much capital. I know what you're saying. Too much capital, how can that be? Yeah, no. Well, remember, this is a cost benefit analysis. I'm going to try to get you to understand it's a cost benefit analysis, and the cost is if we set aside too much, we're not going to be receiving the benefit. Okay, so yeah, you can assume whatever you want, but that's the challenge, and that's why whenever we're talking about the helicopter view, we're trying to see the landscape, and we're trying to see the landscape of how things are going. This is probably the biggest difficulty I have in the academic community. I mean, the academic classroom, as well as in on the on the street / working with professionals. Risk drives returns, not the other way around. Okay? And whenever things going well, we usually forget about risk, and when things are going bad, oh, the world's coming to an end. All right, so the idea, the idea that we need to remember, is that we need to connect risk and return, and essentially, return should be adjusted for the amount of risk taken. And you say, oh, how do you do that? That's easy to do. We can do the Sharpe ratio. Well, the Sharpe ratio is good. But the problem with the Sharpe ratio is that what? The standard deviation assumes what? All kind of characteristics of the behavior of the data generation process. And depending upon the investment alternative and investment vehicle of which you are calculating the Sharpe ratio, it might not be appropriate. Okay, so I guess the point that I'm trying to bring to your attention right now, is that this whole concept of risk management, even at the conceptual level, even at the conceptual level. Before we get into the details of the calculations and this need to be negative numbers or positive numbers, left tail, right tail, how do I sum all that stuff up? What correlation do I do? I mean, even when we're up here trying to define it, not defined it, to define it is difficult. Okay, so I'm just trying to bring that to your attention. It's not impossible, it's just difficult. And now here's just a list of risk classes. I mean, I can read this off to you. Yeah, I can read this off to you. But I think you can. I think you can do that too. But I guess, and also too, and I know I'm about to have one right now. I'm going to have a student say, "Well, shouldn't this be this type of classification or that type of classification?" Try not to get too hung up on the hair splitting activity, because that's just something that you don't need. When you think about market risk, really, we're talking about main systematic risk factors: interest rates, price risk, foreign exchange, commodity prices. Okay, we're really talking about that. That's mainly what we're talking about. Systematic factors. Credit risk, on the other hand, is generally associated. It's not always, but generally associated with some kind of idiosyncratic factor. Right. So default risk. But what are the idiosyncratic factors on credit exposure? Well, default risk. Now, what is default? Okay, default. You can have a actual default, or you can have a technical default. Right. Or you could also have a credit risk associated with a change of a rating, a downgrade risk component. Whenever we had no default at all, okay, and we had no default at all. So I guess what I'm trying to get you to understand, or at least to be able to see here, is that from a classification perspective, we really need to be careful of how we classify how we classify the different I would say, exposures that we have. Right? And so Arun asked a question for me to bring forth again the downgrade risk. So if you are a AAA credit, and things do not things do not look rosy for you going forward, and the rating agency downgrade you to a AA, that's a big drop, but let's just suppose that's a downgrade, right? So essentially, the downgrade of your higher quality to your lower quality. Well, that's a credit risk, right? And you're saying to yourself, well, wait a minute, I didn't have any default. Yeah, you didn't have any default. It was just the expectation of the ability to pay forward has essentially gotten more uncertain, and the greater uncertainty has caused a downgrade in your rating, okay, and your rating. Liquidity risk, probably the most misunderstood or not understood exposure is essentially the idea of liquidity or lack thereof. And what's the problem with liquidity, right? When you're buying, you can buy all day and all night. Somebody's going to sell it to you, right? But whenever you're selling it, there's an old-fashioned, I guess it's an old story about What's liquidity risk? Well, liquidity risk is whenever you can't find liquidity, because that is really what liquidity risk is. Because when you need to sell something and the counterparty is not available, what are they gonna do? They're gonna make you take a substantial discount in order to be able to sell it. And so that's about it. Now, generally speaking, that's one aspect of liquidity. Funding risk is also another problem. That's what happened with Lehman and a lot of other institutions during the 2008, or I'll call it the 2008 crisis, and started in 2007. But when we think about liquidity, it's hard to measure. We have proxies for it, but it's just more difficult to measure because you can't see it until you get whacked with it. Right? You can't see it until you get whacked with it. Operational risk. This is the issue that I kind of mentioned a little bit earlier. Issue about fraud, natural disasters. This is the one where the human comes into play. Yeah, and the one where the human comes into play. And so let's just back up just a tad. Credit risk, market risk. Let's see, where's my other one here? The market risk. Where is it? There it is. Okay. Market risk, credit risk, liquidity risk. You know, that has caused a lot of pain at a lot of institutions. But the one risk that has caused pain and the shutdown of institutions has been operational risk. And it is very difficult to measure. Okay. And it's difficult to measure. Arun, I don't know what that word defaultation. I don't know what that word is. All right. So, the point I'm trying to make is that we have different types of legal and regulatory risk, and let's not get into the new situation about the new situation associated with all the different changes that are going on in government organizations at the moment. But you know, some people would indicate that regulatory risk might be being reduced at the moment. I'm not exactly sure if I agree with that, but you know, because when you think about regulatory risk, it's uncertainty. Okay, uncertainty, right? And so it's uncertainty about being able to. Well, I would say risk is uncertainty, right? So if you can't figure out what the regulations are going to want and or need, that's risk, right? Legal risk, on the other hand, is an issue associated with legally being able to enter into a transaction. That's a big problem. You always say, oh, well, he's got the capability of doing that. Well, is he the one? Is that the particular organization? Is that the unit that has the legal capacity to be able to get into that risk, to be able to get into that transaction? All right. Business risk. I mean, this is usually a little bit more, I would say, known, or it's usually less. Usually less. I guess it's usually less uncertainty associated with some of those factors. Because when we think about business risk, we're talking about the risk of being in an industry. So if we're in the industry of making clocks, I don't know why I'm using the clock example, but if we make clocks, I mean, we're going to be impacted by the clock industry, right? And there will be uncertainties that we have nothing to do with, like interest rates or stuff like that. But there will be a risk associated with being in the clock market, okay, in the clock market. And that is going to be we're going to measure that, generally speaking, by variability of sales and or profit. So that's a little bit, I guess it's less subjective, although everything has some certain level of subjectiveness associated with it. Strategic risk, reputation risk. I mean, these are all these are different risks that you can take a look at here. I think whenever I think of the classes that we're going to be focused on mainly, and we're going to be focused on mainly here in the FRM program, you have to know the characteristics associated with the other one. That's mainly going to be market risk, it's going to be credit risk, and it's going to be operational risk, because those three are the ones that we have a little bit more handle on quantifying them than some of the others. That's not to say that the others are not important. It's just that those three, I think, are the bigger ones that we need to get our hands around. Okay? So risk management at the corporate level. Here's the big picture. And should a corporation hedge or not? To hedge or not to hedge? That is the question. All right. And so there's all kinds of different reasons. All kinds of different reasons. Arun just made a mention. Nestle dealt with reputation risk. What about Volkswagen? I mean, there's many types of examples that you can. That's good that you have some of those examples in your head, but uh, the reputation. I guess there's an adage that it may take 20 years to build a reputation, but all it takes is 5 minutes to tear it down, or something like that. I don't know. I try to think that I have a decent reputation, but my reputation is kind of weird in at the standpoint of I do things unconventionally, and that because to me, passing an exam is about the process. Okay, it's about the process. Um, Shimei asked about the Sharpe ratio. We're gonna get to that issue later. I only use it as an example. We don't need to hound on it right now. But there's an issue with the denominator on the Sharpe ratio, and we'll be discussing it. We'll be discussing it later. All right. So corporate risk, to hedge or not to hedge, and the idea here is that there's some cost benefit, ladies and gentlemen, cost benefit, cost benefit, cost benefit. And I'm just going to hammer you in part one and also in part two about this whole concept of cost benefit analysis. All right. Essentially, what is a hedge? A hedge is taking an offsetted position, because if it's not an offsetting position, then it's not a hedge. What you want to be able to do is to mitigate. It says neutralize right here, but I think it's to mitigate, maybe not necessarily eliminate, but you want to try to. What you're trying to do is you're trying to mitigate uncertainty of anything, right? Or the benefit or the detriment, right? And what are the advantages, right? What are the advantages? Lowest variability of earnings. Might have a positive impact on cost of capital and reputation, because your forecasts have come to fore a whole lot more frequently or closer. Your forecast, not forecast number, what is it? Your guidance number was hit with a lot less uncertainty associated with it. Right? So, and there's lots of different instruments that could be used to affect the hedge, right? But then there's costs associated with it, right? We didn't talk too much about the advantage. I mean, we didn't talk too much about the cost, but there's differential costs about differential instruments, and we'll talk more about the specific cost impacts later. But there is also, I'm just bringing this up, and again, I'm still trying to keep you here at the 36,000 level. Let's try not to get too deep right yet. But when we think about cost, there's also an accounting cost and there's an economic cost, right? Those two are not necessarily the same. And it's not necessarily the same. We're going to be dealing with the differentials of those two later, but just keep that in the back of your mind, is that when we talk about cost, usually in a risk manager perspective, we really are talking about the economic cost. But whenever we do the financial reporting, we have to take into account the accounting costs, and hedging is one of those that's kind of problematic. And how do we match those particular factors? Again, don't get hung up on that. I'm just throwing that out for you later. Think 36,000 foot level. There's some theoretical issues also that are disadvantages for hedging. Miller and Modigliani, hedging does not impact the value of the firm. Capital as a pricing model. It's systemic risk, not the idiosyncratic risk. That's important, because whenever you do hedge a corporation's balance sheet, or you do hedge a corporation's operations, you're hedging the what? The corporation's operations. You're not hedging some kind of systematic factor. Okay? All right. So again, what do I want to bring? If the benefits outweigh the costs, then it's appropriate for you to hedge. If it's not, then don't. Okay? And then don't. All right? Oh, let's see. Should a company hedge? Let's see. What do I want to say up here? We're going to talk, and I made a mention here about this accounting versus economic exposure. I want to get to that. We will get to that later, but I wanted to bring this to your attention now. But really, this is also to it kind of gets back to the process, right? It is that you have to select, or you have to be able to choose, or you have to be able to explain your risk appetite, meaning you have to determine which particular risk you want, you have to kind of measure how much exposure you want, and then you have to determine what kind of hedge you'd like to place if you exceed that exposure. So it's not as simple. There's a process here. There's a process here, but it's not as simple as you'd like to think about being able just to do something like a hedge at the corporate level. Let's forget about the hedge just at the trading desk level. It's the hedge at the corporate level, and that's the whole purpose of this particular reading. Jerome asked this question with the cost of capital. Um, uh, when we think about cost of capital, you think about a balance sheet. Okay, you think about a balance sheet. You've got assets on one side of the balance sheet, yeah, and you've got liabilities and owner's equity on the balance sheet. Think of capital as being required, and this is what is required for you to do what? And to invest in order to be able to generate the asset. Well, that capital is something that you have to raise in order to be able to invest. Think of it as seed corn that you're going to plant in the ground and you're going to get corn, right? I know you're saying so. That's kind of funny example, but that's capital. What's the cost of that corn? What's the cost of that capital? That is essentially the idea that we're talking about. And really, at the level of the firm, that's debt and equity. How much does the firm have to pay for that debt and equity? Okay, and that's what we mean by, but potentially, not for sure, but potentially impacting the cost of capital and at least reducing variability. And reducing variability reduces uncertainty. Reducing uncertainty reduces cost. Okay. Again, what kind of approaches can we take? And these are items that we're going to get into more detail later about the specifics, but we always have to take into account cost benefit. I don't know how many times I'm going to have to tell you about cost benefit. It's cost benefit. It's a trade-off. Okay. So when we think about pricing exposures, we can use forward contracts, which are generally off exchange instruments. And again, we'll talk more specifically about the particular instruments later. Foreign currency, we could use operational exposure hedges and or balance sheet type of hedges. So when you think about operational exposure hedges for a foreign currency problem, let's suppose that you have you're a U.S. domiciled operation, but you have a European division. So really what you want to be able to do is that you want to be able to match revenues and expenses in the European division with what? The currency there. You want to match their expenses in euro with revenues in euro. That kind of minimizes the foreign currency exposure. All right. On the balance sheet, essentially, you can minimize or at least potentially hedge the balance sheet exposure that you have, and that's generally associated with your asset exposure. So if you're let's suppose that you are a commodities related firm like an oil company or an agriculture type of company. I mean, there's balance sheet instrument, or there's balance sheet instrument, not balance sheet. There's instruments that we can use to hedge the balance sheet, right? And to hedge the balance sheet, which is going to be could be futures contracts, could be forward contracts, etc. We've talked about those, and again, we'll talk more about the specifics later. But we just really are thinking big picture at the moment. Interest rate risk. This is generally going to be associated with minimizing uncertainty of changes in interest rates with interest rate swaps. And again, we'll get into the details when we get into the instruments, financial market instruments section. And I think a lot of people kind of forget that we can mitigate interest rate exposure and operational foreign currency exposure by picking a specific geographic location in which to do what? To have the operation in which to do what? To raise the funding. Right? I mean, if you're going to be making a capital investment in Europe, as an example, and so the asset is going to be valued in euro. It's a plant or it's a piece of property. Maybe what we want to be able to do is raise funds in Europe. Okay, raise funds in Europe so that essentially the cost of those funds can be offset by the benefit of that particular asset of which the funds were used to invest. All right. So I don't want to get into too much detail, but I'm just trying to bring this to your attention that I think a lot of people kind of forget that we can actually minimize some of the problems here by doing what? Just picking the right place to be, and picking the right place to be. And then this issue about static versus dynamic. This is another cost benefit type of trade-off. And Static is we put on a hedge and we just leave it there and we don't mess with it. Dynamic is we put on a hedge and we kind of modify it over time. Problem with static is that when we put it on, it's going to be a one-time cost, but it might not be as effective because things on the underlying may change. Dynamic might be more effective, but because we have to make changes, we're going to be incurring a higher level of cost. Garrett asked, can you hedge credit risk? And yes, you can, and we will talk about specific instruments in order to be able to do it, like a credit default swap. I have mentioned this a couple of times, and I will be mentioning this again. There's on-exchange instruments, and there's off-exchange instruments. The three biggest characteristics that I want to bring to your attention about on-exchange, they're standardized, highly liquid, and no counterparty credit risk. And on exchange, I mean, I don't think we've had maybe 2 or 3 exchanges over the past 50 years that have defaulted. It's just when you think about an on exchange risk management instrument like a futures contract or any other contract that trades on exchange, you just don't think of counterparty credit risk, right? The problem is that standardization, okay, that standardization of the instrument might not exactly match the exposure of which you want to hedge. Therefore, you might want to create something that's more customizable or customized for your exposure, which would be an off-exchange swap or a forward contract, as an example. The problem is that since it's customized and it's specific to your situation, it's probably going to have a low liquidity factor, meaning nobody else wants a particular exposure except you. Okay. And then you are going to be introduced to counterparty credit risk because the standpoint is that you're going to be dealing with a counterparty, not an exchange or a structure, on that. Some over-the-counter instruments, swaps, forward contracts, and there's options. I mean, there's all kinds of different structured instruments, and again, we will be dealing with those. I will be dealing with some of the specifics about those when we get into the markets and instruments section. All right. This next topic here about governance, okay, and risk management. This is a pretty qualitative type of topic, and this kind of deals more on the order of best practices and best practices. And again, I don't want you to. Can we assume that default risk for exchange traded instruments is equal to 0? Yes. There's no counterparty credit risk associated. There's no credit risk of a futures contract. You can assume that. All right, you can assume that. Now, again, it's a non-zero probability because we actually have had exchanges default, but the incidence is too low. So just assume that it's going to be 0. Unless otherwise stated, your assumption is going to be no counterparty credit risk for exchange traded instruments, right? So some of these best practices, I mean, we can go through each one of these particular items, but you can you can read it on your own. I don't want to berate you about it, but we think about some of these sound logical, and others you kind of like, how does that work? Well, I think generally speaking, when we think about corporate governance, if your board is relatively independent of management, they're not in the hand of management, and therefore they're not in the pocket of management, and management is not in their pocket. Right. And then I like this one here. I like this last one. Board should consider a chief risk officer. And of course, we're risk managers. We need to have board level representation. We need to have board level representation. All right. But this is all right. So I've mentioned this before, and we will be talking about this a lot later. Okay. We're talking about this a lot later. And that the standpoint is that we are really talking about economic risk, not accounting risk, or economic cost, not accounting cost. And what does that mean? And therefore, we need to measure the economic benefit, not necessarily the accounting cost. And I know you're saying stuff. Well, John, accounting measures are supposed to represent the economic reality of the operation of the business. And yes, that's what it's supposed to do. And that's what it's supposed to do. Sometimes it gets close, sometimes it doesn't. Again, it's a particular detail. We will talk more about it. But the idea here is that whenever we talk about the economic exposure, that's more of a value perspective as opposed to the accounting exposure, which might be, and what I mean by value, I'm talking about current market value or fair value, as opposed to the accounting number, which might be some kind of book value, as an example. That's not always the case, but that's a particular type of example. And risk committee separate from the audit committee, and these audit committee issues that have been these audit committee issues have changed over time, and I'll give you an indication that sometimes the audit committee is not as independent as it should be from management, and therefore does not do a good job in auditing the management's activity. Okay. From an agency culture, the standpoint is that management is supposed to be representative. It must supposed to be representative of, or must be is an agent of the shareholder, of the owner. But because owners in, I would say, modern corporations are atomistic, there's a lot of costs associated with monitoring those agents. And again, we will talk more about some of those costs. We'll talk more about some of those costs later. And this audit committee, what is this audit committee? This is the group that's responsible for the accuracy of the financial reports. And that's a little difficult, right? If you are if you're not independent from management, then it's going to be difficult for you to be, I would say, putting forth an accurate financial report that might not necessarily make management look good. And that's always kind of an issue that has to be a problem. Anyway, the whole deal is that, if you are on this committee, should be independent, and you definitely should know some basic accounting principles, right? Relevant accounting principles for the operation of the business. Okay, operation of the business. And, so that's kind of one of the deals. This last bullet, though, again, this is kind of trying to get at best practices. Audit committees should be independent. Okay, should be independent of management. It's not always, and this whole concept of independence is a relative concept. Okay, relative concept. But the whole idea is that you have to work with management. So being independent from management does not mean you're in a combative relationship with management. It's just you're independent in that you're going to do your job, management's going to do their job, and hopefully what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to benefit from each other's expertise. And you have to work together in order to be able to ensure legal and legal compliance and risk management standards are being met. I mean, that's kind of like the idea. And I'm just giving you an indication that that's the way. That's kind of like the broad structure. It's a broad stroke. It's a broad stroke. Right. Oh, what do I want to say about? This particular slide here. When we think about risk governance, right? We think about risk governance. Slightly different than risk management, but because risk management, we're really talking, I guess, a little bit more. In some senses, it could be more specific, and risk governance is more broad. And some other people would indicate that the governance is one component of risk management. I tend to be in that particular camp, but when we think about governance, this is more of a formal policy of what type of risk you're going to be taking, how you're going to monitor that risk, what is the amount of risk that you should be taking. Right? At the end of the day, all risk managers, all risk governance, all risk appetite statements, everything risk related should be stated in the perspective of increasing the value of the organization. Right? Every activity should be in some kind of way related to increasing the value of the organization. And that means, right? Eileen, that's a great question here. Does that mean the economic value or the accounting value? It's really the economic value. And then the next question is going to come up, well, how do you measure that economic value? Yeah, I know, it's difficult, right? It's difficult. But technically, we should be thinking about the economic value. How much value does the risk management activity bring to, or how much value does the risk management activity increase in the corporation? That's economic, not accounting. And these structures here, these are particular types of members of these different committees: the board risk governance committee, the risk advisory director. I like this one here: knowledgeable on corporate governance and risk management. I hope so. Okay. educates and communicates. So there's all this. I mean, okay, you can read that. Okay, you can read that. This risk management committee, right? Hopefully, the idea is to try and get a handle around the exposures and being able to communicate effectively the exposures that are going to be that can potentially be inducing risk at the firm level. Okay, and it should be a flag. Right? This particular group should be a flagger of these various types of risks. Okay, uh, I'm not sure. We'll talk more about taxes later. Okay. Compensation committee. I mean, this is a big bugaboo, right? Or it's government or corporate managers being paid, or is corporate management being paid too much? Being paid too much, or not enough. Well, I don't know. I guess some people are indicating that management is definitely being overpaid, but let's not get into that. Again, compensation committee should be independent management. Most of these committees should be independent of management, and the compensation vehicles should be used effectively to do what? To enhance the value of the corporation, not necessarily the pocketbook of the manager. Okay? You want to incentivize management to be able to make appropriate decisions, but you don't want to incentivize them so that they take so many risks, or they take so much risk that it reduces the value of the firm. Okay. Where is mine at? Okay. Risk appetite. I indicated previously that we would be talking a little bit more about this. This is nothing other than the propensity to take and to tolerate risk. And what is propensity? Propensity is ability and willingness, right? So all this is indicating, all this bullet point indicates is that someone, the risk committee, someone at the board level should be able to explicitly state what is the risk appetite of a corporation. Okay. And then that risk appetite should be aligned with the business. I mean, if you think about it, if you make clocks, I don't know, again, well, I don't know why I'm talking about clocks, but if you make clocks, you should be willing to take clock risk. Well, you should be able to take all the risk associated with making clocks. And then you should be able to state what those risks are and how much you're willing to take. Right? But you probably shouldn't be taking shoe risk because you're not making shoes, right? And that's the idea, is that the risk appetite should be connected with your operations, and connected with your operations so that it enhances the value of the firm, as opposed to, well, what is it doing? Okay, what is it doing? And that's kind of me. That's really a big thing, right? Interdependence of units here. Technically, functional units are relatively interdependent. When we think about the commodity trading desk and the bond trading desk I talked about earlier, on first glance they look to be relatively independent. They do their own stuff, right? But you should just recognize the standpoint is that they do their own stuff, but they do have an impact at the value of the firm. And so, therefore, some of their activities are connected. Now, even though it might have a low connection or a kind of fragile connection, there should be a realization that there is a connection, and that realization of that connection should therefore be recognized. And that's all this is trying to get at. Okay, that's all that it's trying to get at. Really, this particular slide is trying to get at the standpoint. That's what enterprise risk management is all about: is recognizing the interdependence of units, not necessarily the independence of units. Right, which then leads us to the next slide. Speaking of ERM, what is ERM? Well, it's a relatively new concept, but I'm going to just give it to you an indication here. The best way to think about enterprise risk management is the aggregation of all risks taken at the firm level. Okay? And therefore, it's integrative. It's integrative and recognizes the interdependence. We can say, we can list a bunch of other different definitions, a bunch of different characteristics, but if you can recognize, it's about coming up with an aggregation of exposures and recognize independence of the exposures of the different units. That's what enterprise risk management is all about. There's some costs because This is a difficult thing to do. How do I add the exposure of the commodities trading desk with the exposure of the bond trading desk? Okay. It requires a lot of oversight, okay, and capital, labor and physical labor, intellectual labor and physical capital. But there are some benefits, right? There's some benefits. If you can see a particular type of exposure from the commodities trading desk that could be impacted positively, and what I mean by impact positive, could be mitigated somewhat by actions taken over at the bond trading desk, then you might want to do that. But you won't know that if everything is so independent. Okay, you don't know that if everything's so independent. So that's one of the benefits, and that's one of the benefits. Who's this chief risk officer? I don't know. Okay, I don't know who is that chief risk officer, but relatively new role, and it's like we want board representation. When we think about risk management, it's probably a good idea to have board representation because the decisions that we're making and the decisions that we're representing or the decisions that we are indicating are relatively important for the value of the firm. Okay, and there's all kind of different type of structure. There's all kind of skills. I like this one here. Possess relevant technical skills. Well, I guess the alternative would be to, not possess those relative skills. Okay. And this is a self-explanatory list. I mean, I don't necessarily know if it's self-explanatory or if it's just a lister, but yeah, just all kinds of different types of activities that you should recognize are a component of enterprise risk management. Okay. Um, New reading last year was this culture and risk taking in banks. What this particular article is about is really, if you think about it, I've kind of mentioned this issue, and I think we kind of talked about this a little bit more. Why don't we just sum up all the different levels of risk about the different departments? Because that'll give us a good number. Well, it give you a number. I don't necessarily know if it's good, but it's going to give you a number. This particular reading is trying to get at more of that optimal level of exposure. How do we calculate and come up with these different exposures? And this is at only one type of institution, a financial institution, a bank. Okay, so this optimal level of exposure can be determined a couple of different ways. There is no right way to do it. Again, it's a process. I think there's a wrong way to do it, but I'm not necessarily sure if there's a right way to do it. But you can target a particular credit rating, and that particular credit rating is going to have different type of characteristics or risk exposures associated with it, and therefore your objective would be to minimize those risk exposures and factors that would not allow you to achieve that credit rating. Why is that important? Because if your debt is, if you have a credit rating that is perceived to be decent quality, then your cost of capital will be lowered because your risk is overall lower. Right, so that's one way to think about it. Okay, the reason why it's important for us to take on risk or an optimal amount of risk is because the optimal amount maximizes shareholder value. Right, and you say to yourself, well, how do I come up with that? And you're right, that's pretty difficult. But here's the story. If we just sum up a bunch of different VARs across the different types of operations, and we say, well, we can't take on that risk. We have to set aside all this capital. That might be that we're taking on too little risk. Well, if we take on too little risk, i.e., we don't make an investments or we're not making decent investments, then that's going to have a low return generation capacity. That low return generation capacity is going to reduce shareholder value. On the other hand, if we take on too much risk, okay, then the level of distress, the probability of distress could be increased. The probability of distress increase could cause losses for counterparties. Losses for counterparties could essentially decrease the value of the firm. So it's kind of like you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. The point is, taking too much risk is bad, and taking too little risk is bad. We need to be kind of in the middle, and that's a sweet spot that's really difficult to get after. What is the optimal level? We really don't know what an optimal level. We can't come up with an optimal number, but we tend to think about the idea. It's a constant dynamic process of always trying to get to that optimal level. Okay, as an optimal level. Let's see. If taking incremental risk does not increase, I think I prefer the word increase here. Okay, increase the value of the bank. Sorry. Okay, then investing in risk management is destroying value. And you say to yourself, wait a minute, John, risk management is a good thing. You're a risk manager. Why would that be a bad thing? Well, problem is that the whole concept and this whole activity of risk management is a fixed cost. Actually, we actually have to recognize the standpoint is that there's going to be a fixed cost for us in order to be able to institute some kind of risk management program. Okay. Uh, if the value of the firm is not increased by that fixed level cost, then we're reducing value of the firm. Right. On the other hand, if we take on excessive risk, right, uh, uh, then investing in risk management is adding value. And how is that going to add value? Because it reduces the probability of taking on excessive risk. So when you think about uh, the optimality here, is that really, in order to be able to have an effective risk management program, it needs to increase the value of the firm beyond its cost. On the other hand, what it will do is it will reduce the amount of risk that the firm will take that is above and beyond its propensity, ability, and willingness. Okay, ability and willingness. So from that aspect, that's the idea when we talk about the different amounts of risk and benefits and detriments, right? Again, there are costs associated with risk management programs. There are costs associated with risk management strategies, and therefore all we are attempting to do as best as possible is to minimize those costs or at least offset those costs with some kind of benefit. And we'll talk a little bit more about the potential benefits that could have been accrued whenever we talk about some of the disasters, the financial disasters that we've had. We'll talk about those in a few minutes. Okay. What did I want to say here about? Here we go. This is something that I will bring to your attention over and over again. Risk measures are far from perfect and can result in inaccurate computations. Ladies and gentlemen, every model is wrong technically because if we knew the right answer, we wouldn't need the model. And since we don't know what the right answer, we use a proxy. It's called a model, and it usually generates a number that's off. It usually generates a number that's off. The problem is without having a number, we're kind of operating in the dark. So we need to essentially use the best knowledge that we do have in order to be able to mitigate our particular exposure, right? And so I think one of the things we should recognize is that these particular quantitative measures are going to give us a number that is going to be off, but hopefully it gets us a number that's closer to optimality in that it reduces the ineffectiveness of hedges, it increases the effectiveness of hedges, and reduces the cost and increases the benefits. I think that's the way you should think about it. I think that's the way you should think about it, right? Let's see, what do I want to say? Risk managers might not be given necessary information. That's always a problem. We always make decisions with less than perfect level of information, okay? And that's the perfect information. We just have to recognize that, okay? Just have to recognize that, right? Aggregation of market, credit, and operation risk needs to consider correlation between the risks. So, ladies and gentlemen, I talked about, do I just add the commodities desk risk with the bond trading desk risk? Well, that's one aspect of a difficulty. And then how about if I add the market and the credit and the operation risk of the commodity desk together by itself with the market, credit, and operation risk of the bond trading desk by itself? Wow. And then I try to add that. It's a challenge. Okay, it's a challenge. And then this bank risk profile and performance, governance, incentive structure, risk culture. You can read that in the next section. Before we get to the next section here, I wanted to go ahead and take our second break. Because this next section here is mainly some storytelling about some of the big financial disasters. But before we take the break, let's see. Oh, no, I don't know. Let's see. Yeah. No. Okay. So somebody was just saying that they were having some difficulty with the audio and the video. Okay. All right. Let's see. Boom, 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 boom. Elaine, I'm not sure. Does that mean quantification of diversification effect? I'm not sure what we mean by that. A number of all computations would be considered part. Yeah, Shandon, that's what ERM is all about, is trying to get at a firm level VAR, if you really want to think about that. Okay. Sorry, Jared. In the introduction, I don't know what there may be some audio problems, video problems, etc. So I apologize for that. All right, let's see. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and take our next break, and we will come back. All right. Okay, last stretch for the night. Just two more topics. This first topic on financial disasters, and the last reading is a new reading this year. Really, the first section here on these financial disasters are just really, I would say, two things to try to get your hands around. I don't think you need to know all of the specific, intricate details of every one of the financial disasters that's listed in the reading. You need to get a good handle about kind of what happened, and most importantly, what was really the risk management failure associated with each particular case. And what you're going to see is you're going to see a little bit of a pattern associated with some of these problems. And guess what? Most of the problems that you're going to see are going to be caused by operational issues or the human factor, and not necessarily bad market conditions. That's not to say that market conditions don't have an impact. Right, that don't have an impact. It's just to say that the way that the human has responded to the market impact, or that the way that the governance structure or the way that the operations of the business were created that allowed for some of these individuals to take advantage of the situation is going to be a recurring theme. Not in every case, but you're going to see it a lot. Anyway, so Drysdale, we're talking about Drysdale and Chase Manhattan. Drysdale was able to borrow $300 million in unsecured credit or unsecured line from Chase Manhattan because they were able to exploit a flaw in the system for computing the value of collateral that Drysdale had to put up. When the value of the positions deteriorated, Drysdale went bankrupt, and Chase was forced to absorb the majority of the losses of the credit that they had lent them, or the loans that they had provided to Drysdale. So why did this happen? Okay, and why did this happen? And this was, by the way, this is Drysdale government securities, so they were putting up collateral, i.e., their government securities as collateral, but the way that Chase was calculating the collateral was incorrect. So how did this happen? Well, there was a system flaw that incorrectly calculated the accrued interest on the government bonds that they were putting up for collateral. So that was a problem. Drysdale knew that, and they took advantage of it by taking oversized positions because they knew how Chase was calculating the accrued interest, and it was essentially not calculating it correctly. So they kind of took advantage of the problem in Chase's model, if you want to think of it. So some people would say, "Oh, well, this is model risk," and etc. Yeah, well, there was. Anytime you're being taken advantage of by one party, that's kind of a problem, right? But on the flip side, Chase didn't understand what was going on at the time. I mean, now things have changed, but at the time here, there was a modeling problem. Anyway, so what happened after they took the big hit? They decided to go ahead and recognize a standpoint that they needed to make sure that their models need to be more accurate, and they. At that particular point in time, most banks did not have this risk management control function, or this risk control function for short, and that was effectively put into place almost immediately after this particular debacle. But so, what was the problem here? There was kind of like a miscalculation, and the miscalculation was there. One thing could have, and I'm not saying that there was probably some discussions as to, the way that y'all are calculating that is not correct. Well, I don't know if they did, but Drysdale took advantage of that miscalculation, was able to lever up even greater because the amount of collateral that they had to put up against that leverage was being too highly valued by Chase. And whenever things on Drysdale's end got bad, then the value of the collateral also got bad, which caused Chase to lose a lot. Okay, Chase to lose a lot. Kidder Peabody. Okay, this was Joseph Jett. I apologize. I guess maybe the second and third year that I actually did this, I was saying Joan Jett, and it's not a rock and roll story. This is a government bond trading desk, a government trading desk, a government bond trading desk. Joseph Jett at Kidder Peabody. He was able to take on some substantial positions, and he generated some substantial profits. However, they were artificial. And what he was able to do, what he was able to do was he was able to take care of, okay, or not take care of, he was able to take advantage of a system flaw, a modeling flaw, right, regarding the present value of forward contracts on those government bonds. And so, guess what? He knew, or maybe he didn't. I think he stated that he didn't, but he knew that there was a flaw. And that allowed him to take on outsized positions because the value of the model that was calculating the forward contract that he was using against the securities was allowing him to take on more of a position than he should have. And so what he was generating, and I actually remember this particular story, okay, because when it came public that what happened, I actually used to see Mr. Jett on Wall Street. We with Louis Rukeyser years and years and years ago, before all this. The problem is that Mr. Jett, the amount of profit that he was generating on government securities, I mean, that's an extremely competitive market. It has always been an extremely competitive market, and now it's even more competitive because you actually got computers that are what is the word that I know? Snooping for mispricing. They're snooping for a penny here or there. Just back in this day, you didn't have as much, but everyone was still watching over this market. So the amount of profits that he was able to make had some people kind of scratching his head. Man, this guy must be really smart. But no, it wasn't that. He was just being able to take advantage of a modeling problem. And so the system changed, and guess what? Banks started realizing that, hey, maybe we should be evaluating our traders and trading systems a little bit more carefully going forward because Mr. Jett was able to take on too much of exposure than he should have. And that exposure that he took on really was inappropriate, and it's our fault, and it's on us. And it's on us for not able to, being able to catch that beforehand. So what happened? Okay, what happened? Well, when you think about both of these cases, Drysdale and Kidder Peabody, essentially both of these are essentially a modeling problem. You say that, okay? Agreed. So there was a problem, right? But it was someone's willingness and ability to take advantage of that problem that caused the losses, okay? Or at least. That's not to say no losses would have been incurred, but the amount of losses are substantial and probably could have been avoided if Mr. Jett and and Drysdale Securities were not willing to take advantage of the counterparty structures that they had, or at least in Mr. Jett's case, his own particular firm's case. So essentially what happened here, I mean, both of these cases were based on a flaw in a calculation. But really, the losses, the lose-lose that happened was because someone was willing to take advantage of that. Barings Bank. This is Nick Lisa. This was 1994, 1993, 94, 95 in that perspective. The positions were built up prior to the earthquake in 1995 at Kobe. Essentially, there was an issue with some transactions that occurred on the floor where he was trading he was trading futures contracts and other particular contracts against the DK 225. And I think again, you don't need to remember all the specific details there, but essentially what he was doing was he initiated a long futures position. Oops, sorry, a long futures position in the Nikkei 225, and there was an issue with the position that he placed, and in order to be able to cover up that particular problem in the report, he essentially kind of doubled up. And that doubling up essentially generated even more risk and exposure to Barings, which was the bank at, I guess, the Queen's Bank at that particular point in time. When the earthquake in 1995 hit, Nikkei plunged, and all of a sudden, all of the positions went down substantially. Well, essentially, what happened was that Barings had to shut down, and the reason why this is definitely an operational issue because Mr. Leeson had a dual role as a trader and a settlement officer that allowed him to essentially do what? He traded contracts, right? He traded contracts, and then he reported particular issues that allowed him to do what? Conceal those particular losses, conceal those particular exposures that he had. But something was going wrong. And when the bank, I guess, sent the appropriate auditors to come take a look, he was scrambling to try and cover his tracks, and he did. He was able to cover his tracks, but he wasn't able to cover them fast enough before the earthquake hit. All right. So essentially, this is definitely a situation associated with an operational problem, and we're going to see this again a little bit later. But think about the operational problem that was specific here. It was a dual role of a trader and a reporter, okay? A trader and a reporter, or in this particular case, not a reporter, not a journalist reporter, but a settlement officer who was actually reporting the trades and the activities on the trades, So that's something of an issue that needs to be taken into account. Dual roles of both profitability and auditing, okay, or settlement, or probably trading and profit. I would say responsibility and audit and risk management responsibility are probably incongruent structures. Okay, incongruent structures. Allied Irish Bank, okay, John Rusnak, trading currencies for Allied Irish Bank, and that ultimately led to about $700 million in losses. Essentially, what did he do? Well, he was a big bully. He was a brawny type of individual. Essentially, I guess, spoke ill of his co-workers, and the standpoint of that he was generating these imaginary trade confirmations in order to be able to cover up his positions. And when the back office auditors, the paper pushers, whatever you want to call them, were getting suspicious of the positions, Mr. Rusnak would not reveal the situation. So he was having, I guess he had, in this particular case, he did not have the specific dual role. But essentially what was he doing? He was not allowing the settlement function to essentially do its job. All right. So yes, this was a problem. This was deceit. This was fraud. Okay. And this is a problem. This was deceit. This was fraud. But the trade and settlement functions were so closely monitored or so closely connected that his previous profit generating capacity had allowed him to probably have more probably had more influence on the reporting and on the settlement procedures and settlement processes than it should have. Okay, and so that was kind of the big problem. In addition to that, he took advantage of the, I guess, off-exchange transactions that he did. These particular transactions that he did were not on exchange and standardized kind of contracts, and these off-exchange contracts did not require immediate cash settlement, and therefore he was able to kind of push things off. You know, it's always going to get better the next day. It's always going to get better. It's always going to get better until it doesn't get better, and then it blows up. And essentially, Essentially, that's what happened. So the ending result, both here in Barings, or maybe not ending result, but one of the main causes of both Barings and Allied Irish were the issue of dual roles of profitability and trading with settlement and reporting being connected in some kind of way, or maybe overly influenced in some kind of way, and that caused a substantial amount of loss for both of these institutions. Right? So that's kind of the idea. The end result of both of these is that we need to be able to separate. We need to be able to separate those particular functions. Okay, UBS, Union Bank of Switzerland, 1997, the executive derivatives lost between $400 to $700 million. There's a big number here. And then in 1998, they lost another $700 million due to their investment in long-term capital management. Not sure if you remember long-term capital management, but long-term capital management was the hedge fund that had two Nobel Prize winners, Bob Merton and Myron Scholes, along with John Merriweather, who created the hedge fund. And whenever Russia defaulted on their bonds, it began a cascading problem at long-term capital management because of the position that they had taken against the spread, the yield spread. They were doing a mean reverting spread between the yields of Russian bonds and U.S. treasuries, thinking that they would come back into longer term relationships. And guess what? It exploded. That was kind of like I'd say the first cut on the ankle, and then everything started falling from there. But this is UBS. This is not long-term capital management. The problem is that the investment that UBS had in long-term capital management was substantial, and on top of the previous year's losses that they had were problematic. And so this was an issue associated, this was definitely an issue associated with, there's some operational aspect, but there's also some market aspect in that. And there's some regulatory aspect. They had some British law tax changes. So there were some Japanese bank warrants that were inappropriately hedged, or they were hedged in a manner that really did not result in them being hedged. Incorrectly valued long-dated options on equity baskets. So they had these particular options, over-the-counter type of options, that were for 3-5 years in maturity expiration. I can't remember exactly. Again, you don't have to remember all the specific details, but essentially it was a valuation problem on a couple of their positions. Okay. And that caused all kinds of problems associated with their exposure. And at the standpoint, they had bad valuation models, and those bad valuation models got hit by this regulatory, and some would call it a sovereign problem associated with their investment. And even though it wasn't a sovereign problem for them, it was their investment in long-term capital management as a result of the sovereign debt default at Russia. In Russia, or from Russia. Societe Generale, January 2008, one of their junior traders, Jérôme Carvajal, I think I'm saying that's correctly, probably too much emphasis there. Anyway, he lost about $7 billion. Right? Why and how did that happen? Well, he did some inappropriate trades or had some unauthorized trading activity that allowed him to take on a lot of positions, and those positions that were suffering some losses, he was able to cover them up. How? Because of the incorrect handling of some cancellations that he thought he had. Okay, and you say to yourself, well, wait a minute, how was he able to do that? Because by this particular point in time, this is a decade or so after some of the other financial disasters that we had an individual in there who's taking on these positions, and these positions are not being reported correctly. Wait a minute, how can that happen? We separated the reporting, and we've separated the trading aspects associated with our bank's activities. But Mr. Carvajal had an interesting background, and Mr. Carvajal with training was in IT. It was in technology. It was actually in helping program the trading and reporting system. So he was able to fix the code so to speak, so that it would not reveal, okay, so that it would not reveal, I guess, the true value of his positions and the true exposure of his positions, uh, because of the standpoint is that it was set on a net exposure basis as opposed to a gross exposure basis. Again, it's probably too much particularity that you have to get in, minutia that you have to get into. But the point is that he was able to fix the system, kind of cover up his tracks, all right, until it blew up. And so that's kind of always one of the problems, right? Is that whenever you have an error and you try to cover it up, and then that blows up, and then you have to cover that up with another cover up, and you have to cover up with a cover up, and then soon it's kind of like it blows up on everybody's face. Gesellschaft also happened in 1993, I think. This was also too around the same time of Nick Leeson, but I say circa Nick Leeson, not exactly the same time, and definitely not connected. Anyway, the refining and marketing department had been able or was offering their clients long-term contracts, right, to sell them fixed amount of heating oil and gasoline at fixed price for a 5-10 year period. And that's amazing. I mean, that anybody would have that big of have that long dated of an exposure. So much can happen in 6 months time period, especially for something as volatile as energy. Whatever the case, they were able to set it up and they hedged those positions. So remember, what were they doing? They were selling. Okay, let's go back. Okay, insulate customers from price volatility in the petroleum markets for a fee, meaning that they sold them some contracts, then they received a fee for that. Okay, all right. So they were willing to sell to their customers the ability to buy heating oil and gasoline at fixed price over a 5-10 year time period. Well, that particular contract, that particular exposure, Gesellschaft hedged with a stack and roll strategy. And I don't want to get into too much of the details here, but essentially, what Gesellschaft was doing was that they had these exposures that were due 5 years out, 3 to 5 years out, and essentially they hedged that exposure with a stack of futures contracts, right? Futures contracts, and essentially what happened is that what they did was that whenever these particular futures contracts were about to expire, they just roll them into the next dated contract, and just roll them into the next dated contract. The problem is that the underlying exposure is a long dated exposure whose cash would not come in, okay, whose payments would not come in until they sold the heating oil 3 or 5 years down the road. The problem is that whenever the stack rolled, it would have cash flow needs that were required to be paid then at the roll. So there was a mismatch of liquidity, and there was a mismatch of cash flow. Right? The short forward contracts and the long futures contracts were essentially missed time on cash flow, and those large positions they were required. The positions were moving against Gesellschaft in a short-term perspective. That was causing the amount of cash flow that they needed to cover the losses in the short term on the short-term contracts, and the positions were so large that they were going to have to cover these contracts, even if over a long period of time that they would have been paid back. It's kind of like this: in order to keep the business going, you have to pay for the lights. Yes, you may be getting that $1 million contract payment, 2 years from now, but if you cannot come up with cash to pay for the light bill and the electricity and the plumbing and your employees, you're not going to have a business in 2 years. You're not going to get the cash, and that's essentially what happened to Gesellschaft. Okay, they cashed out their positions, and the reported loss was about $4.5 billion. Okay. Long-term capital management. I already kind of mentioned that a little bit, but now a little bit more detail here as to the specifics of their problem here. They were hedge fund early 1994. They were founded. They generated some substantial results in their first 4 years, 3 or 4 years. I remember I just got my PhD in 1995, and I remember reading about them, and wow, man, these academics, they can go do that. I can go make billions. I can go do that too. And yeah, and that is until they lose a couple billion. How do you start out with $1 billion? How do you end up with $1 billion? You start out with 5 in the hedge fund business. right? Anyway, they had substantial leverage. They were using a substantial leverage in their positions, and relative value, credit spreads, and equity volatility. They were mainly, it was like mean reverting type of positions. And what do we know about mean reversion? In the long term, variables revert to the mean, but during the short term, they can diverge substantially that it kills you. And essentially, that's what happened. And then they got into liquidity squeeze, and they got the liquidity squeeze after the Russian default on their debt caused the position that they had. They thought that the spreads would come back to, I guess, a more historical narrow band, and whenever they defaulted, the spreads widened, so their positions got hit substantially. In addition to that, they got hit with some currency exposure in some emerging markets, especially the Pacific Rim countries, and the flight to quality increased, and now they were trying to raise liquidity with instruments that were uh, uh, low quality and of low liquidity, and they just weren't able to do that. And so they had to liquidate larger and larger positions to cover margin calls. They had to liquidate larger and larger positions to cover losses, and after a while, they had to liquidate everything. Federal Reserve Bank of New York, orchestrated a bailout. They invested 3.65 billion. I don't know how many different banks. I remember when it actually happened. I remember reading it in the Wall Street Journal. This was in 1997, I believe, the specific, whenever I read the details. And I was kind of amazed at how all the institutions got together and put money into this particular deal, because they really didn't know what the positions were. Anyway, a substantial loss. Bankers Trust, hired by Procter & Gamble and Gibson's Greeting. Essentially, Bankers Trust, a derivative shop, was helping manage some cash or funding issues, especially some short-term funding issues is what the situation was explicitly. But the problem is that the positions that they were actually creating were really not that good for Procter & Gamble and or Gibson's Greeting, and they just frauded them, and there was some just they just fooled their clients, and they got caught. Right? So back in the old days, they had wire fraud, and so essentially you could tap a phone. I guess you can still tap a phone now. I guess we hear from yesterday's resignation of one of the new administration's appointees, deciding to resign because I guess they knew what discussions he was having with the Russian counterparts, or his Russian counterparts. It's like, I thought to myself when I first heard that, I was like, how did they know that? Oh, they tapped the phone. It got tapped. Bankers Trust was bragging about how bad they screwed their clients, and oops, they were really kind of taking advantage of Procter & Gamble and Gibson's Greeting. And this definitely was an issue very similar to Mr. Jett and Drysdale. And at the standpoint is that there were these transactions that they didn't understand. They were getting into them incorrectly. But there was also the willingness, the propensity of Bankers Trust traders to take advantage of that lack of knowledge. Right. And so essentially tight controls for dealing with clients. And I mean, I can tell you, full disclosure, I was a Procter & Gamble shareholder at that time, and I remember when that came out, whenever all this came out, I remember a letter from the CEO saying that they were going to get out of all their derivative transactions and not get into derivative transactions because derivatives were bad. And I think it's just it was just a bad structure, and it was just a bad deal. There was a couple of traders who were taking advantage of situations. And I like this last portion. Exercise caution regarding communication that could eventually be made public. You should just recognize that any email you send, any tweet you send, any communication you make is probably going to be revealed if you do something incorrect later. All right. J.P. Morgan, Citicorp, and Enron. I'm not sure if you remember this, but late 90s and early 2000s, Enron was the new thing, the smartest boys in the room kind of thing. Well, Essentially, they had done a deal with Citicorp, okay, and um, they were going to pay cash at a later date to receive cash at the beginning of the agreement. The advantage for Enron was that the company did not have to account for these transactions as loans because essentially it's kind of a weird structure that they had. They received money and they received money and they agreed to back at a certain price and on some oil contracts. And then that potentially was like a loan, essentially. You give me the money now, and I'll pay it back to you later. Well, J.P. Morgan and Chase, J.P. Morgan Chase and Citigroup, they were the counterparties to these transactions, and essentially, it's always whenever you do something wrong, it's probably going to be found out later that J.P. Morgan and Chase knew exactly what Enron was trying to do. Enron did not want to show that particular transaction as a liability on their book, and J.P. Morgan and J.P. Morgan Chase and Citicorp went along with it, and then they had to agree to pay $286 million fine because they helped Enron fraud their investors by helping them not report certain level of leverage on their books. All right. So big picture, okay, big picture that you need to remember with the financial disasters, okay, with the financial disasters, in that, one of the issues is that if you got some modeling problems, that's an issue, okay. If you got some modeling problems, that's an issue. If you have some willingness to take advantage of problems, that's some issues. If you have dual, I guess, responsibilities of trading, profitability and or reporting, that's a problem. And I mean, there's all kinds of issues that we need to take into account. Many of these could have been prevented. Some of them maybe not. At least the level of losses could have been prevented. Maybe the positions were not prevented, but the big takeaway from these stories is operational risk was a big factor. Market risk was somewhat of a factor, but operational risk really was the big player. Really the big player. Last reading and topic for this evening, and this is a new reading for this year. We're going to be getting into more of the structured products kind of issue brought up in this particular reading later, but this kind of an intro to what happened during the last liquidity crisis. Two big issues leading up to the housing bubble: cheap credit and declining lending standards. So I'm not sure if you remember this, but interest rates were going down, and banks were trying to lend at these lower and lower rates. And it didn't matter if you had a job or not. These no doc loans and etc. Come into play, and it really was a function. Okay, it really was a function of banks. My opinion here. I say it really was. What I meant to say was is that it's a factor into the big issue and the overall issue is that banks used to do what? They used to take cash and they would make loans, right? And those loans would then go on the balance sheet and they would watch and to make sure that the people who received the loan would do what? To pay them back. Well, that's essentially what we would call a credit kind of function, where banks are turned into an originate to distribute type of function. So essentially, they were making loans and they would put the loans on the books, but maybe for a 30, 60, 90-day period, and then they would package the loans and they would sell it. They distribute the loans to these investors. So essentially, their issue or their, I would say, role of a credit analyst essentially changed. Okay? Credit analyst essentially changed. So these CDOs, collateralized debt obligations, which is nothing other than the bundling of loans and essentially selling them out on the street, okay, to new, let's say you've got loan 1 and loan 2 and loan 3, and you pool them together, right, and then you sell cash flows associated with each cash flows associated. So you have a senior tranche, you've got a mezzanine tranche. Mm, come on, right? And then you've got an equity tranche, right? Well, the senior tranche is going to receive the capital and it's going to have the lowest credit risk associated because they're going to get paid first. Mezzanine is going to get paid second, and then the equity is going to get paid less. Well, there's also an inverse relationship between the rate of return and the risk. So low risk, low return, high risk, high return. That is until the low risk tranche doesn't pay. Okay, until low risk tranche doesn't pay. And remember, these are all kind of structured type of instruments, and they're all structured based on leverage. And whenever you have the underlying instruments not paying, and the quote unquote derivative instruments, i.e., the securities based on some kind of tranche, okay, or based on the quote unquote payment capacity of the underlying loans, then things start to blow up. And that's essentially what happened. So you're saying to yourself, and someone mentioned earlier, is there a way to hedge credit risk? And credit risk can be hedged with credit default swaps. These are insurance contracts that pay in the event of a default of a bond or a tranche. So essentially, if you had a senior tranche that you were wanted to protect, you had an investment you wanted to protect against its default, you could buy a credit default swap where you would pay an insurance premium and then you would receive a payment if your underlying, I guess, if you want to think of it, insurance exposure were to default. If you'd have a problem with that, then you would receive a payment. Well, all these credit default swaps and securitization and structured products, etc., help exacerbate the originate to distribute model as opposed to the originate to hold model. Originate to hold model. So essentially, what was happening is that banks were now transferring the default risk of borrowers, i.e., from their balance sheet, to investors in what? Into these new particular products. Okay, into these new particular products. And so that particular transfer, essentially was accelerated, and that particular transfer was accelerated from the bank's credit exposure to the investors through this originate to distribute type of model. In addition to that, the asset liability mismatch, So here we are, the banks are now doing what? They're now having loans that they do what? That they package and then they sell off and they receive cash back, and then they do another package and they sell off and they receive cash back. Well, that particular type of aspect requires what? It requires funding, right? It requires funding. Well, that asset liability, because their liability is the funding capital that they raise, okay? Banks were always having to go to the market to raise funds, and that gap caused some liquidity issues to bubble up to the surface, especially and even so for the financial institutions. Okay, so what's the problem here? Leverage is a double-edged sword. It helps your returns and the benefits whenever things are going really well, but whenever things are going poorly, too much leverage is a problem. Large mismatch between asset liabilities, and everything started coming in too interconnected. I don't know if you remember, but back during the 2007, 2008, maybe 2009, banks weren't too big to fail; they were too interconnected to fail, or financial institutions. Right? I made a reference to this particular concept a little bit earlier about funding and market liquidity or illiquidity. Funding, liquidity, ability of an institution to settle its obligations when they're due, i.e., we're going to be able to pay you back. And how am I going to pay you back? I'm going to borrow another. I'm going to take money from party B, and I'm going to take it to pay back what I owe to party C, and then later I'll get money from party A to pay back party B, and then I'll get money from party D to pay back party A. So from that aspect, that's the funding liquidity, the market liquidity, having to sell something when no one wants to buy it. No one else to buy it. So what is this loss spiral and margin spiral that comes into play? The loss spiral. So if I need to be able to sell assets in order to raise capital to be able to cover a loss, I have a loss and I need to be able to sell an asset to be able to cover that loss. Well, essentially, I may cover that loss, but I've had to sell it at such a low price. Now my leverage ratio is going to be going up because my assets have declined. Margin spiral, a forced sale of an asset as a result of increase in margins, i.e. a decline in the leverage ratio, or if you think about the standpoint, the value of the collateral against what you have has declined substantially, and now all of a sudden I need to do what I need. I don't have to sell my asset, technically I don't, but I have to raise money. I have to raise money to meet some new margin call, and that's kind of the problem that has come out there. Network risk, um, increase in counterparty credit risk. All these contracting parties had to seek additional protection and liquidity enhancement from all the other parties. And it was just like party A looking for help from party B, looking for help from party C, looking for help from party D, was looking for party A, which was looking for help from party B. I mean, everything was so interconnected here. And the off exchange kind of idea, or at least I guess the big takeaway, and a couple of big takeaways from this new reading. It's a short reading. It's new, but it's short. And is that banks used to have a function, and whenever the mortgage, I guess, crisis came into play, banks were kind of stuck in the middle because they were being asked to make mortgages at lower credit, I guess, criteria than what they were used to, and they were asked to do that at even lower rates, and they changed their operation model from a originate to keep to originate to distribute, which caused all kinds of other problems. And then, the market for collateralized securities increased and the demand for those particular securities increased. And so it's not like the banks were the only ones at fault. Investors were equally at fault because they were looking for so much yield. So that's the topics for tonight. Let me let me take a look at some of the questions. Boom, 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 boom. Boom, boom, boom. Hey, Sergio, I'm not sure. Asking about Minsky's financial instability hypothesis. Will there be any specific question on the case studies? Yes, you will have some specific questions about the case study. They won't be getting into all the specific details of like, okay, what happened on the 5th of July. But I think the idea is that you have to have a good sense about what actually happened at Barings, and what was essentially what was essentially the risk associated with that. Alfred asked a question about operational risk as a key contributor to many losses, but how should we think about incentives may have contributed to human behavior? Well, Alfred, those were some pretty perverse incentives, don't you think? I mean, banks were being rewarded for offloading some serious junk, and I'm not sure if you remember back in the day, that was called toxic waste. And those subprime loans were, I mean, the probability of them repaying the loans was substantially low, but banks were doing what? They're originating them anyway, packaging them up, and whether they had documentation, whether they had justification of having income or not, it didn't matter. The banks were having incentive to do what? To package that stuff and sell it. So you're right. The operational risk of many of these problems were exacerbated by some of the incentives, and mainly the reasons, I think that goes to kind of one of the hearts of the problems about risk management, right? Is that we look at risk management as being only stop the risk. Well, no, we have to take into account the return, because most people say on the business side it's all about return, risk management side is only about risk. But we have to kind of put those together, and that's always been a difficult problem here. Should not we speak here about AAA rated CDOs, which was overestimated by rating agencies? Well, so Karen, that's always been one of my, it's always been one of my pet peeves about this. We take something that's rated B, put it together with, it's trash, and we put it together with some more trash, and we get some more trash together, and by the power of diversification, we now get something that's gold. that wasn't going to hold up. So yeah, I think that's kind of a problem. Let's see. No, you don't need to memorize the cases. Um, but I think read the notes that we have in the summaries and get your hands around the big picture. A big picture. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, look, we're about 10 minutes over. I apologize for that. I try to keep it right at 3 hours because I know y'all are busy or whatever. I know I've missed some of the questions that you've had, but please feel free to shoot an email over the next day or so. I should be able to take a look at that to the instructor box. And if I haven't been able to answer some of your specific questions, just shoot a message there. But that's how we're going to work every week. With that in mind, the good people over at Calvin Swayze are pulling for you, and so am I. And at the end of the day, you're going to have to put forth some effort and just get started. Tonight. Well, maybe not tonight, maybe tomorrow. Take the night off and make things happen. So I look forward to seeing you next week, same time, same channel, and keep cranking. And best of luck. And let me know how else I can help you. Good night, everybody, and see you next week. Bye.